Imagine a version of the Marvel Universe where there are no more heroes. One where corporations control every aspect of daily life. One where shock is the worst swear word that you can say. This is 2099, and boy is it cyberpunky. The world of 2099 is one of Marvel's more popular alternate universes, and I can't say I'm surprised. Who doesn't love a good cyberpunk dystopia now and again? Of course, the breakout star of the verse is Spider-Man 2099, who the majority of you definitely know. But the original origin of Miguel O'Hara is pretty different than in a lot of modern interpretations, and when these comics were written in the 1990s, I guess I need to clarify, 2099 was not meant to revolve just around him. It was meant as an entire universe, spanning lots of different comics, covering tons of different characters, and of course crammed with as much 90s edge as they could fit into every inch of it. It's ridiculous, of course. I had to read so much awful, shocking nonsense while I was making this video, but also, I can't lie, it's kind of a fun one. 2099 is unapologetically weird and very stupid, making it a great candidate for a long deep dive video, also helped out by the amount of retcons and reboots that this universe has had, much of which are kind of canon because 2099 is not just an alternate universe, it is the future. In this video, I'm going to try and cover every single iteration that 2099 has ever been through, so get ready for some multiverse nonsense and time travel nonsense, sometimes both at the same time, and sometimes technically neither in ways that we're just going to have to accept. Before we get into the deep lore, we need to address one very important question. What exactly is 2099, cosmologically speaking? Largely thanks to the Spider-Verse movies and similar things, you probably think of it as an alternate universe, but like I said, it is the future. So is 2099 the literal destined future of the main Marvel universe as we know it? Like if you were in present-day Marvel and time traveled, would you end up in 2099? The answer, definitively, is yes. Then no. Then no again, then one more no, then yes, then two more yeses, then technically it was the present time for a little while, then briefly yes again, and then finally no, but also sort of yes. What kind of horrible answer was that? Well, that horrible answer is why the video is 2 hours long. As I always say, we have a lot of ground to cover, so let's get started, and we don't have to jump right into time nonsense, because we will start with the 2099 of the original 90s comics. To begin, let's talk about how we got to this point. After all, if 2099 is the real future of Marvel, at least for now, how did things become so incredibly cyberpunk? The decline begins around the year 1999 with a great cataclysm. We don't actually see a lot of this cataclysm in the comics, but an official handbook of the Marvel Universe refers to it as a civil war between humans and a rising mutant population. It also says that there was a spatial barrier that is never explained which blocked humans from leaving the Milky Way. I couldn't find a lot of other reference to this, so I think it was just a quick excuse made up here to explain why 2099 doesn't do a lot of space stuff. The Mutant War lasts for many years, and while humanity eventually wins, it comes at a great cost. Both sides were decimated, and given the nature of the conflict, the superhuman population was hit especially hard. Enough superheroes and supervillains perish that this era is considered the end of the age of heroes, and essentially, the Marvel Universe isn't a superhero one for the next several decades, though it wouldn't exactly be a normal one either. Over the following century, most of the world's governments either lose their power or fall completely, a lot of Earth's surface is turned into uninhabitable wasteland, and California in particular is hit with so many earthquakes and terrorist attacks that large portions of it just straight up sink into the sea, leaving only a smaller island behind. It gets wild. And predictably, as this is all happening, corporations are doing what corporations do and amassing as much power as they can, leading to them being the dominant force in the year 2099. You know, cyberpunk stuff. While there are many corporations in 2099, and we'll touch on a lot of them over the course of this video, the one at the top of the heap is Alchemax. Alchemax is not technically the rulers of the United States of America. There is a president and American government. They just don't really do anything because Alchemax gets to pull all the strings. From a lore perspective, Alchemax doesn't really have like a specialty, they pretty much do everything. But for our purposes, the ones that matter most in the comics are their research and development division, led by a man named Tyler Stone, and the Public Eye, led by a man very subtly named Fearmaster. The Public Eye is the police force of 2099, once again with all the power of a government organization, but technically not one. They are entirely privately owned by Alchemax. Alchemax and most of the other American corporations are based out of Nueva York, which is the 2099 version of New York City. It's basically what you'd expect from 2099 NYC, and if you're curious about the name, I don't believe the change is ever explicitly explained. However, this is just a world-building element that shows up a decent amount in these comics. There's been a good amount of cultural mixing over the century to 2099, and it seems like America and Mexico have had some of the most. There's a lot more Spanish mixed in with English, which you'll just see scattered throughout things. All of this is fairly standard cyberpunk fare. Corporations control everything, nobody is surprised. But there's another element of 2099's world building that sets it apart from other similar settings, that being their religion. A lot of cyberpunk decides to handle religion in one of two common ways. The first option is to make up some sort of weird techno-religion, and the second is to just ignore the concept altogether. But 2099 doesn't do either of those, and instead takes an angle that is far more distinctly Marvel. That's right, religion in 2099 is literal hero worship, which actually makes a lot of sense. After all, you have documented cases of superpowered people flying around and protecting civilians only 100 years prior. That is a prime candidate to make a religion out of. The exact level of religious belief that the people of 2099 have in these heroes seems to vary by denomination, I guess would be the word. One group, helmed by the leader known only as Barrio Man, focused on the ideals of the heroes. Their purpose was to keep alive values of people like the Avengers, Fantastic Four, X-Men, etc. Honor, courage, humanity, these things that the heroes stood for. It was, to be very clear though, still practiced like a religion. They had a holiday named Heroes Day. They even had their own wedding ceremonies officiated by Barrio Man, where the couple would swear on the Codex Heroica. They have no actual superhumans in their ranks, at least not at the start, but it is worth noting that Barrio Man in particular does kick ass. His whole thing is using this superhero iconography to inspire hope and nobility in his followers, and that's actually the reason we never get his name under the mask. He is technically a legacy character. We see the first Barrio Man die in the pages of Punisher 2099, and in the same issue, a new one appears because someone has to take up the mask and be the spirit of their community. However religious it was, Barrio Man's group did still focus on the heroes as aspirational figures, not literal gods who were going to swoop in and change things. But not everybody saw it that way. After all, the Avengers did have a literal god in their ranks. Enter the Thorites, a religious group that for one said screw metaphor, the literal actual Thor is going to appear again in a second coming and save us, and also screw subtlety. When we first see a Thorite, he is hang gliding around the city in a full costume, proclaiming the word of Thor into a megaphone. The Thorite religion is kinda based, actually. One of their main tenets is that the tyrants of corporations must repent because their lord Thor will be returning to, quote, smite down the frost giants of industry. And you know what? Looking around modern day America, hell yeah, praise the Odin son. And with the Thorites briefly established, I think I've covered everything that I want to when it comes to 2099's baseline world building. We will see these elements addressed again, of course, but now that you have some simple context, we can start talking about individual character stories. As I mentioned in the intro of the video, 2099 was never written to be just a Spider-Man thing. He was the first and most popular of them, to be fair, but the comic line released with 4 series all around the same time: Spider-Man 2099, Doom 2099, Punisher 2099, and Ravage 2099. These comics were all really interconnected. For example, in Spider-Man 2099 issue 2, we see the head of Alchemax having a video conference with a rival CEO, and in Doom 2099 issue 1, we see this exact same conversation word for word from the other side of the call. That provides us a nice little transition, so let's start with Doom 2099. This also makes narrative sense because this one doesn't star a 2099 character. Doom 2099 is Doom, like the Doom from all the other Marvel stuff. The comic begins with two criminals on the run from a police drone, suddenly interrupted by Dr. Doom himself just magically manifesting in the desert in front of them, accompanied by one of the longest comic book sound effects I've ever seen. Doom's memory is a little bit messed up, but he knows enough to tell that he's been gone for some time. He's still the same guy though, and so in true Doom fashion, he strikes a sassy little pose, blows up the police drone in one strike, and then demands to be taken to whoever is ruling Latveria in this new time. That turns out to be a character with one of my favorite names in the entire 2099 universe, Tiger Wilde, a cyborg who has successfully isolated Latveria from corporate control and now rules it with an iron fist. Doom barges into Wilde's office, which is apparently a regular event, as some dialogue implies that Doombots try this on a semi-regular basis, but of course Victor Von Doom is no Doombot, so he puts up more of a fight. This ends, however, in something very, very rare in comics, Dr. Doom getting his ass kicked. This is, in fairness, absolutely Doom's fault for not doing his research before trying to pick a fight. After all, for him, it has not been that long, but for the outside world, technology has advanced 100 years. He is woefully unprepared to face Wilde, and his armor gets disabled instantaneously. Wilde then removes Doom's mask, revealing that the guy under there is not Dr. Doom. He looks distinctly different, he's too young, he doesn't have scars, etc., which is weird because earlier in the comic, we saw him manifest in that time portal. This will be explained later. In comic terms, it was a few years later, but for you, it's only going to be a couple minutes, so just hang on. Fortunately for Doom, Wilde then leaves disposal of the body to one of his underlings, a woman named Fortune, and rather than throwing the body away, she takes Doom to a Romani camp. Yes, Doom 2099 not only actively acknowledges that Doom is Romani, it makes a plot point out of it, which is very surprising. From here, the comic goes largely as you would expect, Doom working with the Romani rebels to build up technology again so that he can take down Tiger Wilde and regain control of Latveria. What you might not expect is how fast he's able to do this. Doom controls Latveria again by issue 4 of the 44-issue comic, which just goes to show, don't mess with Doom when his country is at stake. Then the rest of the series is Doom fighting as a monarch once again, though in this he is cast as an anti-hero for a while rather than a straight-up villain. I'm not going to go over all this quite yet because I want to talk about the origin arcs for the other 4 series, but just for the sake of you guys listening, I will explain whether he was the real Doom or not. The short answer is that yes, this is main universe Dr. Doom, but he had been fused with a different guy, leading to his DNA and that guy's being combined, and also memories of that man being infused into Doom's own consciousness. It's weirdly less of a plot point than you would think, and doesn't matter for the majority of the series. It was just a way to introduce a little bit more drama as to Doom's identity. Now let's move on to the next 2099 launch title, where we will firmly stay in anti-hero territory, because this one is Punisher 2099. Punisher 2099's real name is equally as edgy as his codename. He is named Jake Gallows, and before becoming a vigilante, he was a police officer for the Public Eye, the private security force owned by Alchemax. Like the Punisher before him, Jake's family was murdered by criminals, this time a man named Kron Stone, who was human at the time but would go on to become Venom 2099 later. Extra unfortunately for Jake, Kron Stone was the son of Tyler Stone, vice president of Alchemax. Therefore, while Kron was brought in for the murders, unsurprisingly, nepotism won out and he was released with nothing but a slap on the wrist. Outraged by this, Jake ended up digging into some secret Public Eye archives, where he stumbled upon a record of the original Punisher's war journal. The final page of this ended with a call to action. You who find this, I charge you to carry on my work. Given this call and the very specific situation he was in, resembling that of Frank Castle, Jake took up the call and became Punisher 2099. In this role, he's the Punisher. He did exactly what you think he did, though arguably Jake is a little bit more ethical than even Frank was, at least in the early 2099 stuff. He starts off just killing all criminals in the standard Punisher tradition, but he does have a special focus on members of the corrupt Public Eye, and that becomes a larger part of his thing going forward as he learns that a lot of the criminals he's been sent after are just people who have been shunned by society and doing what they need to get by. Plus, given how unambiguously, cartoonishly evil the public eye usually is, it's not that difficult to just see this Punisher as a lot closer to a straight-up hero. The public eye is way quicker to just murder people than actually deal with problems. They actively enable human experimentation. Plus, allow me to remind you that their leader is named Fearmaster, and his power is just body horror murder because he can transmute people by touching them. In one scene, he turns a lady's leg into solid bone just for annoying him, and then she's stuck like that. Punisher, shoot this guy. Though, as an ironic spin on the first Punisher, the Gallows version doesn't always immediately kill people. He does a lot, but other times, in the sick, twisted world of 2099, jail time is actually a worse fate. Jail doesn't exist in this universe because their form of punishment is far more immediate, which I'll talk about in a second, and so Gallows just starts up his own mini prison based on jails of the past because he wants people to sit and suffer for their crimes for a longer period of time. Which I guess would be one thing depending on what the normal sentences for criminals were, but it's not like they just let people off or hurt them really bad and let them go. It is specifically and explicitly stated multiple times in multiple comics that one of the main forms of criminal punishment in 2099 is this thing called gerotoxin, which ages you instantaneously. So rather than putting people in jail, they'll just inject them with a chemical, and then that person will instantaneously age 40 years or whatever, which in my opinion is way, way scarier, actually. That's terrifying. The implications of this are never really addressed, of course. It's just one of those cases of a side thing in the 2099 universe being very weird. But I can use that as a jumping off point to talk about how ridiculous these comics often are, because man, Punisher showcases it well. Really, this panel alone says everything that I need to. Look at him. Look at the pose he's doing. Plus, if that wasn't enough, this pose is him breaking into a hospital. But don't worry, the hospital was a front. How do we learn it's a front? Someone pulls off a dude's blanket and he's holding a gun under there? And then Punisher takes out all the attackers with a weapon called a grenazer, which best I can tell is just like a rocket-powered stick that shoots tasers. And every 2099 comic is like this. It's not just a Punisher thing. Anyway, Jake is able to continue his work as the Punisher due to his own capabilities, sure, but in no small part thanks to staggering incompetence on the part of the public eye as they try to stop him. Jake never actually quits his public eye job while he is acting as the Punisher. He's a police officer too, which is how he gets some secret information, and he is so trusted in his officer job that he is the guy assigned to the Punisher case, which he then, of course, just doesn't solve. And let me remind you, he doesn't wear a mask as the Punisher. He's running around full face exposed, and somehow his identity is not known, and he is assigned as the officer to catch himself. Technically, he uses a device called a face scrambler, which is basically a digital mask that replaces his face in surveillance with this weird pixelated skull, but presumably this only works on machines, and he doesn't have an actual mask on under it. The Marvel Wiki says that this also distorts visual perception, but the citation on this is to an official handbook of the Marvel Universe, and those are written with less canon oversight after the fact, so this was probably somebody just compensating for this weird gap in the originals. In his second stroke of absolutely incredible luck, another special agent is assigned to investigate the Punisher's identity. She actually figures out that it's Jake, but then the two fall in love, so she doesn't turn him in and later ends up dying to protect his identity. Jake Gallows really is just a stupid idiot who survives the danger of 2099 through dumb luck, determination, and a whole bunch of guns. But you know what? That's all 90s Punisher needs to be, so he's fine. Halfway through the first 4 2099 books now, we get to Ravage 2099, a name that probably rings bells for far fewer of you, but with good reason. Ravage was a 2099 original. The story begins with Paul Philip Ravage. Yes, Ravage is his actual name, though maybe it's supposed to be pronounced Ravage or something, I don't know. Like Punisher, he is a character related to the Alchemax police state, but a different division of it. Ravage's origin gives us a little bit more information on how exactly the corporations rose to power, and it happened in such an incredibly cyberpunk way, an event known as the Pollution Wars. Ravage's whole thing is about pollution and the environment side of cyberpunk, and that starts when a bunch of corporations successfully convince the American public that the government is in fact responsible for pollution and the corporations are all innocent. Enough people believe this lie that the megacorps eventually stage a full-on revolt against the US government, overthrowing it and installing a new quote-unquote eco-friendly one in its place, though this is unsurprisingly just a puppet organization controlled by the corporations themselves. Ravage was a hero in this war, but on the corporate side, not because he was pro-corporation, but because he fully bought into all the nonsense they were spewing. This made him a perfect candidate to be the hero of the people in the corporation's new government, and so he got a cushy new job. This position was as the head of Eco Central, Alchemax's anti-pollution division, which sounds great in theory, but in practice was just more corporate super cops. Under this new regime, pollution of any kind was on the same level of offense as terrorism, which, as I'm sure nobody saw coming, was just an excuse for Alchemax to disappear anyone they didn't like under the very, very vague charges of pollution. Ravage himself isn't really relevant to this, though. He's more of a figurehead to appease the public than anything else. But the moment he finds out about rumors of corruption and starts looking into him, his superiors deem him too much of a threat, frame him for crimes, and get him arrested. He is then banished to Hell Rock, the barren, irradiated landscape outside of Nueva York, which is where a lot of the series takes place. Ravage is very much the outside of the city wasteland hero kind of character for this cyberpunk setting. For one, he helps out the poor outcast community led by Barrio Man. Yes, he comes back for a couple issues in this series, and also he fights Deathstrike, and oh boy, we gotta take a minute for Deathstrike. So this is Ravage's nemesis. His name is spelled like this, which is the most 90s thing I've ever shocking seen. He is the ruler of Hell Rock and the mutoids that exist within it, and unsurprisingly, he actually has a deal where he's working with the corporations back inside the city. So that's all fairly normal, at least in the context of the setting. Why did I feel such a need to shout out Deathstrike specifically? Well, it's because of who he is under this incredibly edgy suit. His real name is Graham Stryker, and he is the former president of the United States. Yeah, remember how Alchemax and the other corporations deposed this guy? They exiled him to Hell Rock after that, and prolonged exposure to the radiation mutated him, gave him death touch powers, and now the president of the United States is this. And Deathstrike was not the only one to receive powers from prolonged exposure to this radiation. Ravage himself would gain new abilities over the course of the series. His first power he got through surgical augmentation, he could shoot energy blasts out of his hands, but secondly, he was turned into this more animalistic figure just by existing in Hell Rock for too long. In this form, he had enhanced strength, speed, and durability, as well as claws and horns, which could be used as natural weapons, though even in his human state, he was a war hero before the events of the series, so he was a trained fighter. His control over the powers changed a few times as the comic went on. Sometimes he could control the transformation and switch between human and monster form at will, other times he was stuck as the monster permanently. It just depends on what point in the series you're reading. Ravage briefly becomes a CEO himself after returning to Nueva York, taking over the megacorp Green Globe, which was always actually run by his family. However, Ravage himself was estranged from them for some time and only regained control once his brother was assassinated. This status quo wouldn't last too long, and Ravage would eventually succeed Deathstrike as the leader of Hell Rock, but we're gonna get to that a little bit more in a minute. As the intro very much implied, the timeline of 2099 is weird, and so I'm jumping around, but I'm doing it for a very good reason. You're just gonna have to bear with me. Though I don't think anybody's going to mind this particular jump, because now we finally reach Spider-Man 2099. Everything you think you know about his origin from the Spider-Verse movies, yeah, throw that out. This one is completely different. Spider-Man 2099 Issue 1 shows us Miguel O'Hara, a genius engineer and geneticist working for Alchemax on a very shady project known as the Corporate Raiders. The purpose of the operation was to create agents who could assist Alchemax in hostile takeovers of other corporations. Now, hostile takeover is a term in the real business world, but in 2099 cyberpunk land, hostile means hostile, so this was essentially a superpower project. The core of Miguel's research involves infusing animal DNA into humans, which in Alchemax's defense is like the most reliable way to make a superhero. Unfortunately, it's not working very well, and all of their test subjects end up dying or getting mutated into horrifying monstrosities. Eventually, all these unethical experiments get to be too much for Miguel's conscience, and he approaches his boss, Tyler Stone, to quit his position. But not only does Tyler not accept Miguel's resignation, he actively drugs him with a super addictive substance called Rapture. Now, Rapture is no ordinary drug. It was essentially a control tool developed by Alchemax for use on their less cooperative employees. Once ingested, it bonds to the user's DNA permanently, making the addiction irreversible. However, Miguel had an ace up his sleeve thanks to his particular knowledge. While he might not be able to cure his new addiction, he could possibly push the reset button on it. And so that night, he snuck into the Alchemax facilities that he worked in and started using his machine on himself. The idea of this was not to give himself superpowers. He was not trying that part of the procedure. What we learn is that he had actually input his own genetic code into the machine as part of some earlier trials that were being done on apes. His new goal was to overwrite his genetics with his genetic template from before the Rapture was bonded to him, therefore making it like the addiction never happened, which is actually pretty smart. Unfortunately for Miguel, one of his superiors had seen him entering the lab and figured that this would be a great chance to get rid of an employee he didn't particularly like and frame it as an accident. So while Miguel was undergoing the procedure, this guy messed with the controls, overloading the device and setting the DNA sequence to Spider, hoping that it would just kill Miguel like it had everybody else. But as we can all guess, that's not what happened. This time, the procedure functioned as intended, turning Miguel O'Hara into a Spider-Man, and in this case, I mean it way more literally than in Peter Parker's. Miguel's physiology is a lot more bestial than most spider people, as he possesses claws, venomous fangs, and organic webbing. Of course, he also has the standard superhuman speed, strength, agility, etc., and a healing factor, but to balance this out a little bit, he doesn't actually have spider sense. Though his powers also include extremely advanced senses and minor telepathy, so he doesn't really need spider sense. As Miguel's exiting the device, the guy who sabotaged it tries to shoot him, hits the machine instead, and causes an explosion. This throws the supervisor out a window, and while Miguel tries to catch him, this is when he realizes that he has claws, so instead he ends up accidentally shredding the guy's arm, and he falls to his death. This catches the attention of some nearby public eye officers, and all of a sudden, Miguel is a fugitive. He escapes by catching the hang glider of a passing Thorite. Remember that I mentioned that a while ago? This is where it becomes relevant. The Thorite recognizes this dude as someone very Spider-Man-like and immediately starts coming to his assistance, as Spider-Man is seen as a harbinger of Thor. Yeah, he doesn't really care about there being a new Spider-Man around, but if there's a new Spider-Man, then there might be Thor later, and so this is somebody worth helping. Miguel doesn't originally want to be a superhero at all, and in fact, he only suits up because a bounty hunter named Venture has been sent to capture the escaped spider guy as Alchemax wants to research him, and Miguel decides to hide his identity during that fight. And now I get to share what is one of my favorite fun facts in all of Marvel, the nature of Spider-Man 2099's costume, because it's very weird and tells a fun little story about Marvel publication in the 90s. The costume is made out of unstable molecules, which is the same thing that the Fantastic Four suits are made out of in the main universe. This is a little bit more common in 2099 apparently, but it's very expensive, and the only reason that Miguel had a suit made out of them lying around was that it was a Day of the Dead costume that he wore at a festival, and apparently those festivals get crazy enough that he wanted an indestructible costume for it. But the real fun fact comes with the suit's color. Now that probably sounds weird to you. I mean, you're looking at a picture of it right now, and it's red and blue. Except it's not. Spider-Man 2099's costume is canonically red and black. There are multiple mentions of this in really early Spider-Man 2099 comics. People explicitly say that he is wearing black, his black-clad butt, etc. But it looks blue, so why on earth is that? If you're very familiar with 90s comics, you probably know the answer to this already, and even if you're not familiar with 90s comics, you know what the art style is, right? Like if I say 90s comics, you can picture a rough image in your mind because a lot of them shared similar visuals. One very common element on those suits was to highlight black areas of the costume with the color blue. You can even see this on Venom. He looks blue in a lot of shots, but that's just because that's how the artist decided to draw his shading. This was what Spider-Man 2099's suit was originally intended to be. However, for reasons unknown, that's not how it got interpreted. Honestly, if I had to guess, I bet it's just association with the character of Spider-Man. Readers were so used to seeing him in red and blue that they interpreted this costume as not black with blue highlights, but blue with black shadows. And that misconception became so popular that it eventually just became true. If there's a definitive point where his suit changed color, I can't actually find it. Marvel just stopped acknowledging it as black and red and started acknowledging it as blue and red, and since that's what everyone thought it was anyway, it went unnoticed. Of course, in the later 2019-2099 reboot, which we will be talking about later in this video, they go back and retcon in an explanation for this. But trust me, when it happened, this was not an intentional thing. It was just a mistake that made more sense than the intent, and that is why his suit is red and blue today. Though one thing that has not changed in today's interpretations of Miguel is his character and personality. That edgy, brooding version that you've seen in the animated Spider-Man movies, oh yeah, he is like that right from the jump. His writing is, I'm just gonna be blunt, it's god-awful. It is so incredibly 90s trash that it's kind of hilarious. In his first issue, there's a scene of him talking to Lila, who, yes, is also a character way back in this original, and she does the standard AI thing of just informing himself about the day, telling him the time, the temperature, the weather outlook, etc. This is not like a plot point. The only purpose of this panel is establishing that Miguel has an AI assistant, but she does tell him that there's a 50% chance of rain, which Miguel then responds to by saying, 50%, that means maybe it'll rain, maybe it won't. I don't know why he says this, there's no reason for him to, but he certainly does. Also, in a future issue, he breaks the fourth wall just to make a joke about killing Aunt May. Lila is rotating through alternate personalities that she could use instead of the woman that she usually appears as, and she appears briefly as an old woman who looks uncannily like May Parker, and then Miguel looks directly at the reader and says, "Kill that one," at which point she vanishes. So with all this in mind, I'm really not surprised that Spider-Man 2099 became the immediate standout of this line. He is kind of cheesy, yes, but he's self-aware about it, and his origin is genuinely pretty cool. Cool in an edgy way, but that was the entire point of these 90s era comics. Thanks to his popularity, Spider-Man 2099 had the longest running of these original 4 titles at 46 issues. A lot happens during these. He fights a bunch of 2099 versions of popular Spider-Man villains like Vulture and Green Goblin, and also, Alchemax Vice President Tyler Stone is revealed to secretly be his father. But we're actually going to be skipping through a lot of that. Disappointing, I know, but here's the thing. Remember that whole bit I did at the beginning of the video where it was like, yes, no, yes, etc.? We are still on the first yes, and so I'm gonna have to cut some things. There are more characters that we need to cover before we can really move on to the next iteration. With the 2099 launch a success, Marvel added some new characters and books to the lineup. We're not going to spend too much time on these, but some of them are just too cool to skip, so we're definitely going to talk about them, starting with Hulk 2099. Hulk 2099 didn't actually start with his own self-titled series, he just appeared in the 2099 Unlimited anthology book, but despite that, his origin is one of the wildest in the entire verse. Remember how a while ago at this point I said that California had gotten really shocked up during the 100-year gap between the 90s and the 2090s? Yeah, the island that remained of California became known as Lotus Land, and Lotus Land was still a hotspot for film production. Enter John Eisenhart, a studio executive who was researching a group called the Knights of Banner. The Knights of Banner were another superhero religion, but a much smaller one, just actively a cult that was worshipping the old Hulk. Eisenhart thought that the Knights had an interesting enough story that he could make a movie out of it, so he approached them wanting to buy the rights to that sort of project. They turned him down though, at which point Eisenhart tricked a young member of the cult named Gawain, yes, like the Arthurian Gawain, into revealing all of the group's secrets to him. Through Gawain, it was revealed that the Knights weren't just worshipping Banner, they were actively researching gamma radiation in an attempt to make a new Hulk, and so Eisenhart reported them to the public eye. However, instead of just arresting the Knights, the public eye arrived and just straight up started murdering all of them. Eisenhart, feeling horrible about this, managed to save Gawain, but during the chaos was struck with the Knights' experimental gamma weapon, turning him into Hulk 2099. After this incident, Hulk 2099 vows to protect the young boy and becomes a superhero. He doesn't appear much since he was usually just in this anthology, but he does fight a cyborg named Draco who takes over Lotus Land. Unfortunately, he's not very good at what he does, largely due to the fact that he has one real mission, which is protect Gawain, and Gawain still does die. So rip that kid. Not too much more to say about Hulk. Like I said, we're going to cover these later ones fairly quickly, but I know the next one is going to be a character people are excited about, Ghost Rider 2099. Ghost Rider 2099's real name is Kenshiro Cochran, nicknamed Zero because of course he is, and he was, get ready for some real cyberpunk nonsense, a hacker who operated out of Transverse City, a gigantic city in quotes really, that is just a massive mess of highway that occupies what was once Detroit, Chicago, and the entire span between them. Zero ran with a gang called the Hotwire Martyrs, who ran afoul of another gang called the Artificial Kids with a Z when he tried to hack into a trunk line and snag some data. Jesus Christ, this one is so cyberpunk. Anyway, he dies in this fight, but in the last second, he uploads his consciousness into cyberspace where he meets a bunch of rogue AIs that call themselves the Ghostworks. The Ghostworks want to take down the corporate-run society and choose Zero as essentially their avatar, putting his consciousness into a robot body so that he can enact their anarchist anti-hero ideals. Thus, he becomes known as the Ghost Rider. He has nothing to do with the spirits of vengeance, or spirits, or magic at all, really. He's just a hacker consciousness in this Terminator body that is amped up to the 90s maximum with laser eyes and a chainsaw in its hand and all that cool stuff. His main villains are another megacorp named Demonics, not actually demonic, of course, but they're named that for the vibes, I guess. And of course, Demonics is helmed by Zero's father, because they have to make this as edgy as they can. Ghost Rider 2099 is neat, but he is one of the most isolated 2099 characters, appearing in almost no crossovers and really just showing up in his own series, where he dies and then gets revived and it doesn't really matter. The last series that we're going to talk about in this section of the video is X-Men 2099, which is largely what you'd expect, a bunch of rebel mutants fighting against evil corporations. Though interestingly, the roster was entirely original, not even 2099 versions of older X-Men characters, it was all new people. The team's roster changed constantly, so I don't have time to go over all of them, but notable members included the team's leader, Desert Ghost, an anti-corporate revolutionary who in this book was a villain as often as he was a hero, Junk Pile, a very brief member who betrayed the team in issue 2, but is worth bringing up because he looks almost exactly like a Transformer. Technically his power is absorbing metal, but come on, look at him, he's a Transformer, right? And Cerebra, who is a telepath with the ability to detect mutant genes. So I guess she is kind of a port of a main universe character to 2099, but like a port of Cerebro, not technically an X-Man. X-Men 2099 was decently popular, enough that they got a spin-off series entitled X-Nation, which actually did feature a main universe character ported to the future, this one being Exodus, who had just slumbered for 100 years and woken up in 2099. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about before we start getting into the timeline weirdness is the 2099 Asgardians. These technically don't have their own series, but the concept of them is fascinating and deals with the superhero religions, so they are absolutely worth getting a spotlight. There's a whole group of these, specifically 2099 Thor, Loki, Hela, Sif, Balder, and Heimdall. However, they are not the originals from the 616 timeline, and they're technically not even Asgardians. The 2099 Aesir, as they are referred to, were not gods at all. They were a project by Alchemax to actively exploit the Thorite religion. See, the Thorites were actually pretty major. Punisher 2099 himself was one of them, and Alchemax saw an opportunity there. The Thorites were largely fanatics. I mean, not all of them were, but there was a good enough chunk who were hang-gliding around the city. So, they just made themselves a couple of heroes, taking a bunch of chosen people, including Thorite Reverend Cecil McAdam, and experimenting on them, giving them powers similar to that of the old Asgardians. These new Aesir were an immediate hit with the people, and so Alchemax set them on the evil vigilantes that were attacking the corporations, because as you could probably tell, literally every other hero in this universe is anti-corporate. This is the jumping off point for the first major crossover of the 2099 universe. Everybody, Punisher, Ravage, Spider-Man, Doom, and others all united to take down the 2099 Aesir. Despite being very important to the lore, the Aesir don't actually show up that much outside of their one event. In fact, one of them technically never even sees combat. There is a Lady Sif as part of the program, but she dies during the experimentation. The only 2099 Aesir who remains a problem after the crossover is done is, I suppose fittingly, Loki. While the rest of the Aesir were all mind-controlled by Alchemax into believing that they were legitimately gods, Loki managed to trick his way out of not getting that part of the treatment, so he was fully aware that he was a fraud, he just didn't really care. Once the Aesir thing is over, he uses his shape-shifting powers to rebrand as Halloween Jack. And you don't really need me to explain his personality to you. His name is Halloween Jack, and he looks like this. Make a guess, and it'll be right. And now, I want you to put a pin in this moment right here. And I'm not going to exactly explain why that is the case, but trust me on this. Just note in your mind that this is a pivotal moment which we will be returning to later, and it's going to make sense when it happens. At least as much as any of this time travel nonsense is going to make sense. The next point that we're going to be hitting is a comic called 2099 AD. Now that might sound weird. Isn't all of this AD? Yeah, technically it is, but AD in this case does not mean Anno Domini, it means After Doom. So about halfway through the 2099 imprint, somewhere in the mid-90s, Doom 2099 takes over the United States and becomes president. This was not a 2099 reboot per se, it was the same continuing universe, but it was a notable status quo shift that also gave Marvel an excuse to cancel all the titles that weren't selling very well, so the 2099 lineup got very much slimmed down. In this new era, a bunch of characters get assigned new roles. Punisher 2099 becomes the head of S.H.I.E.L.D., a new organization that Doom establishes to replace the public eye, and Ghost Rider, the anarchist android, gets his protocol overridden and also becomes an enforcer of Doom. As for Ravage, he objectively meets the worst fate in Doom's new reign, as Doom coats the entire island of Hellrock, along with all of its inhabitants, Ravage included, in liquid adamantium, and then just shocking chunks it into space. So Ravage is gone. Doom's run as president actually doesn't last too long though, as he is violently ousted by Captain America. Like Steve Rogers' Captain America, who has somehow shown up in 2099, though this is revealed to actually be an imposter Steve who is, guess what, controlled by Alchemax. Evil fake Steve then becomes president after Doom and orders the execution of a bunch of heroes who worked for the previous administration. This does just straight up kill them. They don't survive or get resurrected or anything like that, which was also another excuse for Marvel to cut a bunch of lines that weren't selling well. As you can probably guess, this is very much the decline era for 2099. Some of this actually has real-world reasoning, as Marvel fired the editor in charge of this line during some cost-cutting measures, and a bunch of the creators who were making the comics quit in protest, so they just did not have anything working for them at this time, which meant it was a great time to introduce new comics. This is when that X-Nation spin-off I mentioned happens, and also is the introduction of Fantastic Four 2099, not even really worth mentioning much because they are not new characters, it's just the present Fantastic Four sent into the future, and the comic did not last long enough to be that interesting. As the F4 thing implies, this is also when Marvel started experimenting with time travel from the present to 2099, and there were a couple crossovers between the Spider-Mans and the Dooms, though those were the only ones. As a last-ditch effort to save the series from its rapidly failing sales, Marvel canceled all of the other 2099 lines and sort of combined them into one called 2099 World of Tomorrow. The largest plotline of this involved the alien phalanx invading Earth and somehow flooding America, which later caused more conflict with the Atlanteans. It was not popular at all. It ran for 8 issues and then was promptly canceled. Then the last vestiges of the 2099 imprint, though obviously not forever as the length of this video very clearly shows, was 2099 Manifest Destiny, a one-shot comic that was supposed to wrap everything up. This comic it is certainly a lot. The big inciting incident in Manifest Destiny is that Steve Rogers shows up, but it's not an imposter, this time it's the real one, who was apparently put into some form of stasis a second time. And in the future, he also becomes Thor, because, you know, the whole Thorite religion, he's basically their Jesus. Now, technically this next part is a correction of something I said earlier in the video, but I thought it would be funnier if I addressed it here because of how wild it is. Remember near the beginning, I said that there was a brief handbook mention of a spatial barrier that was keeping humanity locked to Earth? Turns out that wasn't just mentioned in a handbook, it is from Manifest Destiny. In this comic, Uatu shows up and informs the heroes of Earth about this barrier, and then a major plot point is all of them going into space so that they can use their powers to just kind of shoot the barrier until it breaks. They don't have to do anything fancy to disable it, it's literally just everybody shooting the space wall. Opening up intergalactic travel again helps their society advance, and so then the remaining pages are speedrunning through a time skip of the next 1,000 years or something, where they expand into space and everything gets fixed. And then as a final bit of weirdness, Ghost Rider 2099 ascends to becoming a transcendent AI supergod. And that's it, the original 2099 is over. And now, you probably picked up on the fact that I really ran fast through everything between After Doom and Manifest Destiny, and there's a reason for that. Remember that pin that I told you to drop? It's going to become relevant in a few minutes. While 2099 would be referenced occasionally in the coming years, the next major 2099 publication came in 2004. This was a mini-event called Marvel Knights 2099. For those not familiar with the Marvel Knights title, it's an imprint that Marvel used to use for some of their grittier, darker comics. They're apparently bringing it back briefly, but that's another story. For Marvel Knights 2099, it was 5 one-shots: Daredevil, Black Panther, Inhumans, Mutant, and Punisher. The thing that made Marvel Knights 2099 kind of odd is that it had legitimately nothing to do with the original. Yes, it was a bunch of new characters, but these new characters weren't even in the same iteration of 2099. Even the Punisher 2099 was a completely separate one. As you might be able to guess from the fact that these comics were marketed as an alternate version of an alternate future, I don't think they were super popular, at least not to my knowledge. I did have to read all of them for this video though, and I can now say that while they weren't popular, they're also not good. The Marvel Knights 2099 world isn't even really cyberpunk half the time, and I need to say half the time because these comics don't make much of an effort to even feel connected to each other. There is technically a very, very loose thread about anti-mutant stuff, but it's not enough to keep things cohesive. Luckily, these are all one-shot comics, so I can just blast through them real fast. Mutant 2099 is the comic that gives us the most information on this version of 2099, which again is just totally unconnected to the previous in every way. This one diverged from the main timeline because of a thing called the Mutant Registration Act. Basically, someone figures out a process to identify mutant genes at birth, and then all of those people are identified and given mutant suppressing drugs. One kid named Chad Channing, wow, discovers the preserved brain of Reed Richards underneath the Baxter building, and Reed supplies him with placebo medicine, which he then takes instead of the mutant suppressing drugs, allowing his powers to flourish. Those powers are telekinesis, but like a weird type of personal telekinesis, which he uses exclusively on himself. He can increase his own agility and strength, stick to walls, and also propel himself through the air in a weird bouncing sort of motion, which, yes, is basically just psychic mutant Spider-Man. That's kind of all that this character is. Daredevil 2099 is Samuel Fisk, grandson of Wilson Fisk, which is actually a pretty cool concept. He still runs the Fisk crime family and is well aware of how his family's history works. He has heard the story of his grandfather killing Daredevil with his bare hands, which is something that happened in this world's history. Possessing all the power and resources of the Fisk Empire, but feeling very guilty about how exactly it was gained, he spends a lot of his wealth on making an advanced battlesuit and goes out to fight crime as Daredevil 2099. He's basically Batman more than he is Daredevil. He's kind of just Bruce Wayne, but with crime history and a red suit, and the visuals definitely support that. Punisher 2099, or I guess specifically Marvel Knights Punisher 2099, has a somewhat interesting concept, but doesn't get the time needed to develop it right. The book is about the daughter of Frank Castle and Elektra, who has carried on her father's legacy and kept being the Punisher into her adulthood. When we meet her in the comic, she is old and dying of cancer, and then the plot is about her passing on that family legacy to her son, who for some reason looks distractingly like Cloud Strife, but whatever. The idea of a teenager having to take on the very loaded title of the Punisher despite not really wanting it is an interesting idea, I'll give it that. Unfortunately, since this is just a one-shot buried in a collection of AU stories, it does not have the time to develop the characters to a point where we care about them, and therefore just falls flat. Also, I need to point out the insane false advertising on this one, because this woman is supposed to be old. Like, that's the point of the book, and she is drawn to look old in the actual comic itself, but I guess that they decided that would not sell well on the cover, and so she looks like this here. Black Panther 2099 is a strange one because there's really no reason it has to be a 2099 thing. There's nothing future-y about it, it just reads like a Wakanda versus Latveria AU. The Wakandan royal family is dead, I guess that's kind of future-y, but whatever, and a high council has been assembled to take their place. Then, an army of Doombots attacks Wakanda, and one councilman, a man named Kashamba, manages to escape. He becomes a resistance leader against the occupation, takes on the title of Black Panther, and manages to drive the invaders out. But then there's a final twist, which reveals that Kashamba was working for Doom the entire time, and this entire invasion was a plot to install Wakandan leadership that would be subservient to Latveria. And that's just how the comic ends. This one has a bad ending, actually. And then finally, Inhumans 2099. This one is kind of boring and pointless. The Inhumans live in a spaceship now because they left Earth after human oppression, and Maximus, the main Inhuman evil guy, is their leader. Then Black Bolt wakes up from cryostasis and sees that Maximus is in charge of everything and freaks out and screams and blows up the ship and kills everybody. And that's just it. The 2099 Inhumans never show up again, and that's also the end of the Knights 2099 event, a weird little chapter in 2099 history. So now you might be starting to get an idea of what the whole yes, no, no, yes bit from the intro was. 2099 has reboots and time shenanigans. Knights was one of the no's that I was talking about. This is just a separate one that mattered for about a month and then never again. The next 2099 that we're going to be covering is another one of these situations. There was a gap of a couple years in 2099 publication to 2009, with the very subtly named Timestorm 2009-2099. This one is at least a little bit closer to the original because it does share several characters, but those characters have entirely different origins and personalities, so I don't know how much they exactly count. The plot of this one does begin with Jake Gallows as the Punisher, but in this third distinct iteration of 2099, his family was not killed by Kron Stone and was instead killed by costumed people pretending to be superheroes. This meant that rather than hating criminals, Punisher hated all superheroes. He is then sent back into the past of 2009 by Tyler Stone, who is manipulating Punisher by pretending to be Thor. He gives him the sacred mission to kill all heroes in the heroic age, and he starts by shooting Spider-Man. Peter Parker's apparent death starts screwing up stuff in the timeline, but then of course it is revealed that Peter did not actually die, and somehow Punisher's gun sent him into 2099 instead. Cue the rest of Timestorm, basically two storylines happening at the same time as characters from the 2 points in the timeline cross over with each other. Now, this doesn't sound that weird at first. Sure, there's a different origin for Punisher, but otherwise, the idea of there being an official time travel crossover between the 2 points makes sense and wouldn't necessarily break canon. Except, for reasons unknown, they decided that their most popular character from 2099, Miguel O'Hara, should be just an entirely different guy. This Miguel is a teenager who is in a science class when the temporal anomalies, predictably named the Timestorm, hits 2099. The combination of radiation from that event and the spider in front of him is what gives him his abilities. So they just kind of took Miguel, removed the unique parts of his origin, and turned him into almost one-for-one future Peter Parker. Then, since Peter is also in 2099 at the time, the two team up, he teaches the younger Miguel how to use his abilities, and everything else proceeds as you'd expect. There's a lot of fights as things and people from the timelines cross over with each other, and it's all eventually stabilized by Cerebra, the psychic mutant from X-Men 2099, though once again a younger version. Most of Timestorm was pretty forgettable, but there is one character from it that I really like, that being Human Torch 2099. His name is Relur, and ironically, he's not actually human, he is an Atlantean. He is also a mutant, and his power is fire generation like the classic Human Torch. Interesting power for an Atlantean, right? And at first you might just think it's useless since he's using it underwater, but any physicist will tell you that if his ignition is hot enough in a deep, high-pressure environment, that is a very, very dangerous ability to have. He is then banished to the surface by his people, who see him as a crime against nature. There he fights and later teams up with Spider-Man 2099. So on the one hand, they are still just making Miguel like a Peter clone by having him befriend Human Torch, but on the other hand, I really like this as a character concept. The idea of an exiled Atlantean firebender is cool as hell, and I would love to see a version of this character appear in the main universe at some point. Timestorm and this version of 2099 never really mattered again once it was over, but I will say that after reading all of it for this video, it almost seems like the writers were trying to set it up as the new 2099 status quo that would get more content later, but then it never did, and so it goes into the record as just another weird alternate 2099 that would not be referenced anymore. Fortunately though, we are now done with these. Everything for the rest of this video is going to be more related to actual canon. No more strange, confusing 2099 reboots that aren't related to the original. Now, we just have strange, confusing 2099 reboots that are related to the original. Yay! Oh, I need to mention something else. I'm cutting in and adding this after the fact, so if the flow of the video gets broken a little bit, it's because I'm recording this later, but I realized that I definitely need to briefly mention the video games that feature 2099. These two games, Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions and Edge of Time, came out in 2010 and 2011 respectively. They were very popular and probably one of the things that kickstarted the reappearance of Spider-Man 2099 in 2013, which we're going to talk about in a minute once this little cut-in is over. These games actually predate the original idea of Spider-Verse. The Spider-Verse event wouldn't happen until 2015, and the writer of that, Dan Slott, has openly said that the games were one of the inspirations for it. They featured different versions of Spider-Man teaming up across realities, and 2099 was one of these. Whether this technically counts as an alternate universe or a future timeline is sort of left up in the air because, again, this was before Spider-Verse, so the distinction in Spider-Man stuff didn't really matter as much yet. These games are not directly connected to the lore or world of the comics, which is why I didn't process I should probably mention them in the original recording, but the 2099 that we see here is pretty close to the 2099 from the 90s. Miguel himself is playable, and we see many 2099 villains appear as enemies and bosses. Even Kron Stone makes an appearance, though for some reason he is Scorpion, not Venom as he was in the originals. I don't have too much that I need to say about these games because, like I said, they are a spin-off series and not directly related to the comics lore. But screw it, while I'm here, I might as well clarify something else related to Marvel video games, that being Penny Parker. This will be quick, but if you're a Marvel Rivals player and are curious why Penny is not getting mentioned in this video, she is treated as a 2099 character in the Rivals setting, but in the comics, she is not that. She's from a different Spider-Man alternate future, but it was easier in Rivals to just loop her into 2099, so that's what they did. The rest of the 2099 setting there is actually pretty comics accurate though. Fun bonus thing you can do on your next Rivals game on that map, check the skybox and you'll see the logos and buildings for a lot of the corporations that I've mentioned throughout the course of this. Okay, there we go. Video game clarification intermission over. Let's get back to the 2099 comic stuff. The next 2099 story happens in the pages of Superior Spider-Man, which is actually my favorite Spider-Man comic, so I'm very happy to talk about it. This story revolves around Spider-Man 2099, the normal one from the original stuff, getting sent back into the past where he actually ends up staying for a while. And I bet a lot of you have easy predictions as to what exactly is happening here. He's gonna do a Back to the Future, and that leads to the next iteration of 2099. And you're right, but not quite yet. It's time to return to the pin. To refresh memory about the time status of what we've gone over so far, the original 2099 universe back in the 90s was meant to be the future of the main Marvel universe. Like if you were in that world and time traveled forward 100 years, you would end up in 2099. The next two, Knights and Timestorm, were not that. They were not official futures, they were like weird alternate universes of a future time skip, which is probably one of the reasons why they weren't super popular. But if you remember back to the originals, I had you drop that little mental pin about halfway through the first 2099. This is going to be like the most confusing thing in this video, so if you can get through this, you will be cleared for the rest of it. The Superior Spider-Man story we're about to talk about features Miguel O'Hara, the original from the 90s, time traveling backwards, but he doesn't time travel from the end of 2099, he time travels back from the pin. For some reason, Marvel decided that this was the point Miguel should be time traveling back from. Not anywhere near the end of the 2099 stuff, but from the middle of it, before President Doom and that whole arc. And while he's in the present, he does do a Back to the Future, he does change the timeline, and the 2099 where President Doom is a thing never ends up happening. But not in a he changed things and now stuff is different kind of way, in a way where it just gets sort of retconned and erased entirely. This is weird, so I'm gonna make a diagram for it here. This is how these time travel things usually go, right? You have your one original timeline, then a character travels back to a previous point, changes things, that timeline branches off, and when the character returns to the future, he's in the new branched one and everything is different. We've seen this before. That is not technically what Marvel did though. Here is what the 2099 timeline looks like. We have the present, we have the future with 2099 and the President Doom stuff, and then we have the pin in there. Spider-Man 2099 time travels back arbitrarily from the middle of the timeline at the pin because that's just what Marvel wanted to do, and then changes things from here. So not only is the timeline changed when Miguel returns, like in a normal time travel story, this little chunk at the end past the pin where the time travel happens just sort of gets sliced off like it never existed at all. Nobody experiences this in any capacity anywhere in the multiverse. It no longer exists because Marvel just maybe accidentally retconned it out of reality. This is never really explained and seems to be more of an unintended consequence of how they decided to write this comic more than anything else. But yeah, that's why I just ran really quickly through everything after President Doom. It was written in the 90s and now is just irrelevant for every purpose. If this was a multiverse storyline, it would make enough sense, right? This timeline got screwed up and so it splinters off and becomes its own universe out with all the rest of them. But it's not a multiverse storyline at this point. This 2099 arc is explicitly a linear timeline, which we know because that's the entire point. It's about Miguel accidentally changing things in the past, which then irreparably changes the future. That means it's not a different universe, it is one continuous thing. Now, the good thing about this is, like I said a second ago, if you have not turned the video off in frustration and confusion, we are through the worst of it. The weird 2013 retcon that they accidentally did is absolutely the most confusing thing in 2099's history, and the rest of this will be far easier. So, now let's talk about specifically what Miguel was doing in the past. Back in the present day, some time weirdness is going on, of course. It revolves around this thing called the Time Gate, the existence of which is jeopardizing the life of a man named Tiberius Stone. Now, you might recognize that last name because Tyler Stone, the vice president of Alchemax, has been mentioned many times. And yep, Tiberius is his ancestor. He is also the guy that founds Alchemax, so his existence is very important to 2099 existing as it does. Tyler does not want Tiberius dying because, well, if his family lineage goes away, so does he. And he ropes Miguel into this because, if you'll recall, Tyler Stone is secretly Miguel O'Hara's dad. Now, this is good enough reasoning for Miguel to go along with all this because if Tyler vanishes, so does he. But importantly, Tyler does not know Spider-Man 2099's secret identity, so there's a weird gap there. Why would he ask Spider-Man 2099 for help if he doesn't know about the linear connection that is keeping them tied? The way that they resolve this is a really stupid cop-out excuse, yet it somehow also makes sense, and so I kind of love it. Miguel tries to ask for another reason to go because he's gonna do it anyway, but he's trying to keep his secret identity under wraps, so he doesn't want to go along with it so easily. And then one of Tyler's agents is like, well, we're looking into the future right now, and you're showing up there, so clearly you're going to do it. The reasoning doesn't really matter. We can see you going to the future, so why don't you just go right now? This works, and with the help of Superior Spider-Man, Miguel is able to stop the Time Gate incident and save Tiberius's life. But then, because Tyler is an awful person who does not care about his son and only cares about himself, he just leaves Miguel stranded back in the present because, well, that way he also gets rid of Spider-Man 2099. This looks like a win-win for him. While in the present, he decides to use his time in this era to make better changes for the future, not through massive sweeping alterations to the timeline, but through little nudges. To this end, Miguel O'Hara goes undercover in present-day Alchemax under the incredible pseudonym Michael O'Mara. But I mean, I guess he was from the future. It's not like people would expect him to be there, so it doesn't have to be the best name. This also conveniently leaves him in the present for the first Spider-Verse event, which Miguel is a big player in. 2099 as a reality also plays a big part as well, but Marvel kinda wants to have their cake and eat it too here, treating it as either an alternate universe or a future of the same timeline, just based on whatever they need it to be for the story. For a good chunk of Spider-Verse, they refer to the 2099 future as Earth 928 and jump back and forth between it and other realities just like it's any other alternate universe. But then they stop treating it like this the second Spider-Verse is over and go back to acting like it's the future. So for this purpose, just treat it like it's the future because I believe that's what matters more. Regardless of how exactly 2099 fits into the cosmology of the Spider-Verse event, once it's over, it has provided Miguel a way to return to his own time, and this is finally where he Back to the Futures it. Remember that I said the 2099 timeline was a relevant location in the Spider-Verse comics? Some of the Spider People actually used it as their base of operations for a while, and it was here that they built a new multiverse hopping device. Tyler Stone was spying on them as they did that, though. He then copied their device, allowing him to time travel as well. Yes, he had some time stuff before, but that was different and more situational. This one gave him a lot more control. So while I said that Miguel did a Back to the Future, it's really Tyler who did it, and there's another step in there. Miguel time traveling back accidentally gave Tyler the information he needed to time travel himself, and then he goes back and alters things by becoming the leader of a terrorist organization. Confusing? A little bit, yeah, but the good news is that the specifics of it don't really matter. All that matters is that after Spider-Verse, when Miguel tries to time travel back to his reality, it is not the same at all, and is now a dystopian hellhole ruled by the Maestro, a future very evil version of Hulk. While the cyberpunk corporate 2099 wasn't necessarily great, this one was objectively worse for everybody, and so Miguel naturally wanted to go back again and undo the events that led to this worse reality. Fortunately, he had an ally in this new future in the form of Strange 2099. This is not Dr. Stephen Strange, it's a different woman who just goes by the codename of Strange, but she is the Sorcerer Supreme of this era. She actually appeared in the 90s comics briefly as well, so she knows who Miguel is, and thanks to her magic, she is able to remember the previous 2099 and survive through the reality warping. With Strange's help, Miguel is able to go back to the present and work on setting things right, and as he does so, he also sets up a sort of time window that would be constantly open, allowing him to peek into the future whenever he needed, so that he could make sure he wasn't breaking things further. Just, check up on it on a regular basis, make sure everything looks the same no matter what he's doing in the present day, which seems like a good idea, except having a constant time portal open isn't a good idea at all, and unsurprisingly, a villain from the future sneaks through there and starts messing up things again. The fight with this bounty hunter sends Miguel into 2099 yet again, where it has been Back to the Futured a different time. It's still not the original 2099 as it should be, but it's also not the dystopian Maestro-controlled 2099 anymore. Instead, it's a secret third thing where the Sinister Six have somehow gained control of Alchemax and used their power to outlaw all superheroes. Miguel is able to piece together the course of events that leads to this outcome, and so continuing the pattern of him just ping-ponging back and forth between timelines, he returns to the present with the goal of making sure that the Sinister Six future does not happen. And that is kind of what they do, but Secret Wars is in the middle of this, so we need to sidebar for that. So Secret Wars 2015 is a whole gigantic thing, and the overarching plot of it is not super relevant to the 2099 story, but for this to make sense in context, I do have to very quickly go over what the concept for this Secret Wars was. The multiverse gets destroyed, and Dr. Doom, who was at the center of this gigantic thing, manages to salvage pieces of as many realities as he can and slam them all together into one planet called Battleworld, where the different realities are kind of like different nations. These areas were referred to as domains, and 2099 was one of them, but a new 2099. Not the original from the 90s, not any of Miguel's Back to the Futurings, this was a completely separate one, but we have to talk about it briefly, both because it is pretty cool, and also it will be relevant in a couple of minutes. This one is a lot closer to the original. It still has characters like Strange 2099 and even John Eisenhart Hulk, but there are some important differences, with one of the biggest being that Miguel is now the head of Alchemax. Apparently, in this one, Tyler was not an awful father and actually accepted his kid, so now Miguel Stone is CEO. He does still have spider powers and is also notably less evil, plus he is the assembler and leader of the 2099 Avengers, who are the main characters of this little miniseries. Their Iron Man is Dr. Sonny Frisco, whose powers and core concept are pretty similar to the original Iron Man, though I do really like his suit. I hope we get this as a skin in Marvel Rivals at some point. Hawkeye and Black Widow are next, who I lumped together because their gimmicks are pretty similar. Both of them just take their animal names way more literally. Black Widow is a Spider-Woman and Hawkeye is a Birdman. There is technically a Vision 2099 on this team, but they are pretty different from the original. This one is a precognitive android that the team uses to predict events, but while this one diverges a lot, the next one is very similar to the original. It's Hercules. And it's just the same Hercules. He's an immortal, he lived to 2099, and he's still doing superhero stuff. But the most important and most interesting member of this team is their Captain America. This is Roberta Mendez, and she is essentially a Captain America sleeper agent. She was forcibly subjected to the super soldier serum, and her civilian persona has no idea that she's actually Captain America, but she has an activation code word, and so whenever Alchemax needs her to lead the Avengers, they just give her that, she turns into her Captain America mode, and when her work in the field is done, she goes back to civilian life none the wiser. This also conveniently gives Alchemax a way to instantly deactivate Captain America if she rebels against them, which of course does happen. Yeah, Miguel is the leader of this Alchemax, but I didn't say he wasn't evil, I said less. The 2099 Avengers fight the 2099 Defenders, a vigilante group not affiliated with any corporations. Their roster is pretty simple. Strange and Hulk 2099 we've already talked about, and the next two are Valkyrie and Silver Surfer, who, like Hercules, are the same ones from the main reality, they are just immortals who stuck around. The only really new one is Submariner 2099, who is a genetic experiment conducted by Alchemax to make a human who could live underwater. Technically, this guy is also from the 90s comics, but he only appeared in 3 issues, he's more relevant here. Secret Wars 2099 was only a little mini-series, and it ends when Baron Mordo, who was secretly working for Alchemax the entire time, summons this giant squid monster, then the Avengers and Defenders team up to fight it, and Miguel forgives them and clears all their criminal status. Like I said, he is less evil. So why did we sidebar that? I mean, obviously the characters are cool and worth talking about, but like, this was right in the middle of Miguel's time-hopping adventures. This was a weird little tangent to go on, but it is relevant. If you'll recall what I was talking about before Dr. Doom hijacked the entire plot, Miguel and his allies had figured out what they needed to do to set the timeline right. No more Back to the Futures, they had a path in front of them and they were going to return everything to normal, which they did, mostly. When Miguel actually enacts the plan and returns to 2099, it's not identical to the one that he was trying to get back to. It's definitely closer to it, it's not actively controlled by new villains like it was in the previous 2 incarnations, but elements of it have been blended with the Secret Wars Battleworld one. Plus, somehow Roberta Mendez Captain America has been time displaced and also ended up in the main timeline. This isn't like a new version, this is the literal one from Secret Wars who survived the whole multiverse restructuring. For this new 2099, in which Marvel just bites the bullet and calls 2100, things are basically the same as they were, but it is notably different and notably weird. However, Strange tells Miguel that they cannot risk doing it again, because they've been bouncing around so much the fabric of time is like one poke away from breaking. Therefore, they decide, you know what, this is close enough, and this is what 2099 is for a bit. This makes it essentially a soft reboot for 2099, a way for Marvel to bring the status quo of the reality back to what it was in the 90s, while also giving them an excuse to change things that they wanted to. So, reasonably, this brings us to the modern era of 2099 that all the recent comics have been in. Or at least you'd think that, wouldn't you? And you would be wrong. Everything would change one more time in 2019, real world year 2019, which is a very big one for Marvel Comics as a company. The first Marvel comic ever was published in 1939, so 2019 was the company's 80th anniversary, a very big milestone and also one that put it at a midpoint, because not only was 2019 80 years back to the company's founding, it was also exactly 80 years forward to the year 2099. Given that this was such a perfect opportunity, which would literally only happen once, Marvel capitalized on it and released a really big 2099 event, and this one would set the status for the universe going forward. This event begins in the present day and revolves first around Doctor Doom. Around this time in the comics, Latveria was embroiled in some very complex political stuff, and this led to Doom getting assassinated. I mean, it wasn't actually Doom, of course, and this leads to one of my favorite scenes in the entire event, where Spider-Man just swings past all the bodyguards, rips the assassinated guy's head off, and is like, it was a Doombot. Did people not expect it was a Doombot? Obviously it was a Doombot. Right after this, Spider-Man 2099 shows up very randomly and delivers a cryptic message to Peter Parker about the future always changing before getting all weird and warpy and vanishing again, once again confirming that this 2099 is the future of the main Marvel universe and not technically a separate AU. Anyway, even though the real Doom survives, somebody one-shot sniping a Doombot at a diplomatic event gets him royally pissed off, and he goes on a rampage the likes of which had not been seen before, not only taking the entire world over, but using his position to wipe out heroes as a concept. The exact way that he pulls this off is par for the course in terms of complexity, but relative to this video, so it is still quite complex. After Doom goes on his little rampage in New York City, he returns to Latveria to start making war preparations. Reed Richards then pays him a visit to try and talk him down, which goes about as well as you would expect something like that to. They end up fighting, and the fight spirals onto Dr. Doom's time platform, a really iconic time machine for the character that I'm amazed has not been explicitly mentioned until now, but I know the Doom fans are very excited to hear the words. The platform takes both of the combatants to 2099, or maybe like a year or two before, but somewhere in the late 2090s. It also has some side effects of messing up their memories, especially the memories of Reed, who gets himself entangled with Doom. We then see Doom, in quotes, going on a little post-apocalyptic wasteland adventure, which reveals that in the gap between the present and the 2090s, much like the original, there has been some catastrophe that destroyed the world, though the nature of this one is explained even less than the previous. This Doom eventually arrives in Latveria, where it is revealed that he is actually not Doom, but is instead Reed with messed up memories. The real Doom has been doing his normal thing and already established himself in this new world, where he is about to enact a big plan. Latveria was hit especially hard in the Nebulous Crisis, turning into a landscape called the Ravage. Not like the character Ravage, that's just the name of the place. Characteristically bitter about his home being destroyed, Doom vows to fix the world in his image, and since the heroes and villains of the heroic age were responsible for that crisis in one way or another, he erases memory of them. With a combination of complicated magic and also exploiting the hell out of the abilities of the Watcher, Doom not only erases the heroic age from history, but also wipes it from everybody's minds, leading to a 2099 where there are no more heroes and nobody has any idea that there ever were. This means that the new destined future of 2099 was similar enough at a base concept, but different enough that, well, that Marvel could use it as an excuse to reboot the entire thing, taking elements of all of the previous 2099s that they liked and combining them into one new unified one. And I'm willing to accept the confusion because of how unified this one actually is. Everything after this 2099 has been relatively cohesive with one another, and they don't seem like they're going to reboot it anytime soon. This one has been going for 6 years and counting. Though before we talk about that, which is what the rest of this video is going to be about, I should briefly address a continuity question that I'm sure some of you now have. If Doom and Reed get sent into the future and then they do things in 2099, what about in the present? Like, there's still a Doom and a Reed, so how did that happen? Aren't they in the future now? The answer is that Marvel sort of just hand waves that and moves on. I originally tried to do a full in-depth explanation of this as best I could, and it was like 10 minutes long and still didn't make sense, so now I'm just gonna give you the short version. By pure coincidence, really, Spider-Man, like Peter Parker Spider-Man in the present, happens to have a time device that can look into the future as Doom is going on this assassination-fueled rampage, and then in his comic, he's able to avert this future, so Doom and Reed never actually do their time travel thing, but then, for unexplained reasons, the new version of 2099 remains, even though logically it really shouldn't. If you want a better explanation, no. Cause as best I can tell, there isn't one. But now things are gonna get good again because the new 2099 is largely interesting and well thought out. It, at the surface level, resembles the old one. There's a lot of corporate control and oversight of things, and people worship superheroes as religious figures. But now you might be wondering, how is that the case if nobody remembers them? And that is the jumping off point for the new Age of Heroes in 2099. Remember, Doom was able to wipe everybody's minds via magic, and now his spell is weakening. People aren't immediately regaining their memories and history, but they are starting to seep back in. And because they're getting these weird clouded half memories, they are not seeing them as pure history yet, but they are interpreting them as myth and religion. So as the concepts of superheroes and supervillains are slowly starting to re-enter the public consciousness, the world is being primed for a resurgence, and that's exactly what we get. The real beginning of the new heroic age is once again the appearance of Spider-Man 2099, whose origin is relatively simple, but is also a little bit of time nonsense. We're never going to escape it fully. The core elements of this Spider-Man's origin are basically the same as the original, but shuffled around a little bit. Miguel O'Hara is still a scientist working for Alchemax, he still gets addicted to Rapture, though that happens earlier in this version of the story, and he's still working on genetics research which is related to spider DNA. However, he starts having hallucinations of the previous 2099, because, you know, Doom didn't make this one just through normal time travel, he also used magic to create this splinter reality, and I guess somehow that means that this Miguel remembers it, at least subconsciously. And then the previous Miguel O'Hara shows up, but he's an old man. Like, this is the Miguel that had gotten sent into the past previously and then just lasted to 2099, and he tells this new version of himself from the new timeline that he has to become Spider-Man to kick off the Age of Heroes, and Miguel eventually reluctantly does so. As is an excuse that I've had to return to way too many times in this video, this is dumb, but I'm going through it quickly because it doesn't actually matter that much. Marvel just wanted to have the old Miguel show up in this, I guess, but after this, he never shows up again, and this 2099 is a true reboot. And it's a reboot that happens to work very specifically in a way that is great for the kind of YouTube videos I do. I'm gonna peel back the curtain for you guys a little bit. Originally, when I decided to make a 2099 video, it was just gonna be about this reboot, and then I decided, screw it, let's make it feature length and go back through the whole history. But the reason that I wanted to do a modern 2099 video is that this new universe is just unapologetically a character showcase in every conceivable way. And it kinda rules. 2099 is Monster of the Week now. There are loosely connected plot lines that go throughout multiple comics, but the vast majority of the single issues are just about one popular hero or villain and their 2099 version. This, in my opinion, is exactly what something like 2099 should be. You have your core protagonists, like Spider-Man, but the other promise of every issue is that you're gonna get to see a character you're familiar with in a cool new cyberpunk variant. This new format seems specifically designed to just let the comic creators have fun in a very low pressure environment, which means that basically anything can happen. You want techno cyborg man thing? Go for it. Conan the Barbarian with a Nova Core helmet? Yeah, that sounds neat. Space warlock Silver Surfer who gains powers from a demonic deal with Mephisto? Sure, why not? There are so many crazy characters in the new 2099, and we're going to talk about all of them, because this format also makes it very easy for me to just tell you about cool cyber characters, and therefore your reward for getting through all the time nonsense is just a rapid-fire bombardment of awesome shit. These little showcase miniseries are 5 issues each, and every batch has its own distinct theme. We will start with the first of these lines, the one that launched alongside the 2099 reboot in 2019. The theme of this one is largely characters who were in the original 90s comics, and also Conan is here. Doom 2099 is the first in this set, though we're actually not going to talk about this one, not because it's bad or anything, but because we already did. This is the comic that elaborates on how exactly Doom created this new 2099 in the first place, which we already covered. The second is Ghost Rider 2099, which we can also kind of skip because I guess Marvel's writers decided that Zero Cochran was perfect as he was in the 90s. This comic is not changed at all. It's not even really a reboot. It is nearly shot for shot what the 90s one was. Zero Cochran is a hacker from Transverse City, hacks into the wrong thing, gets himself killed, uploads his consciousness into cyberspace where he meets a rogue AI, and then gets downloaded into this anarchist Terminator body. He then goes on to fight Demonics, which is run by his dad. Really, the biggest difference is that they kind of speedrun that arc in this one singular issue, and he just murders his dad with his chainsaw hand right at the end before going on to other things. Now we move to Punisher 2099. This one is actually different. Under this skull is a man named Hector Tago, though interestingly, Jake Gallows is still around in this universe, he just never became Punisher. Both this Jake and Hector are agents of the Public Eye, which still exists in this 2099 in essentially the same form, Alchemax's private police force, but in this reality, they have some new tech. The most important of this is a system known as the Iris, basically a hyper-advanced body cam which directly records the sensory input of officers so that events can be experienced from their perspective later. When this comic starts up, we see Hector using the Iris to revisit logs of a Thorite uprising that he was assigned to. During this incident, he killed one of the Thorites who was wielding a weapon and threatening another officer, but for some reason, this doesn't sit right with him. He has a nagging feeling that things actually went down differently, but he's not 100% sure, and since the record is right in front of him, that's what everybody believes. But he feels weird enough about this to dig into it further, uncovering larger police corruption. This is gonna get real dark for a second, but I guess that's what you should expect from Cyberpunk Punisher. It turns out that the events recorded by the Iris were actually being manipulated, and during the Thorite incident, Hector did not kill an unarmed protester, but had mistakenly killed a man who was surrendering as he thought the guy was armed during the heat of the fight. Since this was obviously not a good look for the public eye, it was completely wiped from the record, and it turns out that Jake Gallows was actively involved in this. Not able to live with himself as an officer after realizing the truth of what happened, Hector releases the unedited footage to the public and becomes the Punisher, vowing to take down the organization that he previously worked for. As part of this, he kills Jake and then goes on the run, now a fugitive exile. I actually really like this Punisher 2099. I mean, obviously it's dark, but I feel like this one leans into the cyberpunk things way more than the original did. The original was just kind of normal Punisher, but with cyberpunk guns. This one has theming. We get to leave dark territory for the next one with Fantastic Four 2099. The Fantastic Four are a team known for being optimistic and positive, except not this one, not at all. This one is arguably scarier than Punisher 2099. This issue begins with Herbie, not even Herbie 2099, the same Herbie from the main timeline who has persisted into the future, though he is the only member of the Fantastic Four to do so, and is now looking to reunite them in some way. His memory is a little bit scattered. It seems like he's had some kind of malfunction over the last century, but regardless, he unites with a bounty hunter named Venture, yes, a version of the same bounty hunter who kept fighting Miguel in the 90s comics, and they go out looking for the Four. As their journey continues, they pick up a band of misfits with powers uncannily similar to the people that they are searching for. One with ignition abilities, one who can turn into crystal, one who is a shape-shifting technomancer, and one with an invisibility cloak. As you would expect, their hardships bring them together, and they realize that they can now be the new Fantastic Four. Herbie has not found his original family, but he has united the team nonetheless, and now they can progress into the future. And then they fucking die. In the literal last pages of this comic, all of the new F4's powers malfunction at the same time, leading to them perishing in horrifying body horror-esque ways, to which Herbie has a freak out because his plan didn't work again. Yeah, it turns out that Herbie's malfunctions were way worse than anyone had thought, and he had gone completely off the deep end, conducting experiments on people in an attempt to try and recreate the Fantastic Four anew. He had done this a lot, and they had all failed, killing the subjects in horrifying ways. And then the comic ends with Herbie apologizing to the dead F4 for messing it up again and saying that he's going to keep trying and, I guess, presumably killing more people. There were mixed opinions on this one when it came out, because it's really not this until the end. The big twist is very unexpected, which some people liked and some people understandably didn't. Moving on from that, we get to the new Venom 2099, whose origin is probably the simplest of them, so this will be quick. The Venom symbiote in this pairing is presumably the exact same symbiote, once again just surviving into the future, but under the symbiote is a teenager named Aaliyah Bell. Aaliyah was very badly injured in a vehicle crash as a child, and as a teen was subjected to an experimental treatment by Alchemax. I'm sure everyone can kinda see where this is going. The experimental treatment, while marketed as a miracle cure, was actually them testing out how to bond their captured symbiote to people. So Aaliyah gets bound to a piece of the Venom symbiote, not actually the whole thing, but this is enough to take her on something of a rampage. For most of the issue, she just has a Venom arm because this is all the symbiote can muster, which is actually kind of interesting, though at the end she recovers the other pieces and basically just turns into a normal version of Venom. There's not that much cyberpunk in this one, it's kind of just medical experiment Venom. And then they do the classic Venom thing where the symbiote wants to eat people, Aaliyah will not let it do that, and so they become an anti-hero pairing where the symbiote just really messes up bad people only. Lastly, for the original batch, which yes, there are 6 in this one, I miscounted, there are 5 for all the future ones, but this one has 6, Conan the Barbarian 2099, who I briefly pitched at the intro to this section. Conan is one of the few people who actually had an understanding with Doom through the whole erasure of the heroic age. Because of this, he was allowed to become king of a land that once occupied Mexico, as long as that kingdom would stay on good terms with Latveria. When the sorceress Morgan Le Fay, who was an enemy of Latveria, tried to escape through this land, Conan kept up his allegiance to Doom and killed her. But in her dying breath, she cursed the barbarian, saying that he would be immortal until the sun itself burned the earth under his feet. Now, this all happened sometime before 2099. The origin of the Conan story happens when Doom erases the heroic age, and over time, as the rest of the world becomes more cyberpunky, Conan's kingdom withers. Conan, of course, is fine as he's now immortal, but he doesn't have the great power that other regions of this world do, so he watches helplessly as his people flee his region to other places where they will be safer. However, all this changes when a member of the Nova Corps crashes in front of him and dies. In his final breath, the man gives Conan his Nova helmet, which is what gives all the members of the Corps their powers, and asks him to return it to the Nova Corps out in space, a charge that Conan accepts. Thus, we have galactic cyberpunk Nova Corps Conan the Barbarian, which, I mean, yeah, nothing else exemplifies the writers just having fun with it concept of this 2099 more than this dude. And of course, this is not just an arbitrary combination of things, it is directly related to his curse, as the ability of the Nova helmet to travel through space lets Conan break it. He uses the helmet to unlock an abandoned Nova Corps spaceship which was left on Earth, takes some earth, just like some dirt from the ground, puts it on the ship, and then moves the ship close enough to the sun that the heat from it scorches the dirt away, along with the ship itself, of course, but Conan is protected by the helmet and survives. And since the light of the sun has burned the earth under his feet, Morgan Le Fay's curse is shattered, and he is free once more. He doesn't die immediately either. This is not a case where the immortality goes away and he crumbles into dust. No, he sticks around, he keeps the helmet, and goes on to keep having space adventures. This one kicks ass. The only thing that is really disappointing about Conan 2099 is that he never shows up again. We're going to address the 2099 Nova Corps. I know people were probably curious about that, but sadly, even when those characters start appearing again, Conan does not. This is the one comic where he actually does things. After Conan, the first batch of the 2099 reboot is complete, and we can move on to the second one, which is a lot more centered around Spider-Man. This batch is called Spider-Man 2099 Exodus, and it begins with a Celestial crashing into the planet. To recap again how these little batches of comics are going to go, essentially each set of 2099 comics has a loosely connecting arc that stretches across all the characters, and they will progress it a little bit in each one until the eventual conclusion. With this one, the Celestial crashing into the planet is the big thing that's happening. The Celestial's name is, or was, Jovion, who is killed when Dr. Doom coats Hellrock, yes, like Hellrock from the original Ravage comics, in adamantium and shoots it into space like a bullet, exactly like what happened in the 90s comics, except in this case, it's targeting the Celestial, whose corpse crashes into Earth and creates this place called a Celestial Garden. This garden is full of good stuff and everybody wants access to its resources. So Norman Osborn, the same Norman Osborn who has lived this long thanks to the goblin serum in his system, puts a bounty on it, promising great riches to whoever can deliver control of the garden to Norman's cabal. One of the first people to respond to this bounty, and conveniently the first showcase character of this miniseries, is the Winter Soldier, or more specifically, Winter Soldier 13. This Winter Soldier was a cyborg, one of many built by Russia as technological super soldiers. Unsurprisingly, the Winter Soldiers were not treated very well, as both memories of their former lives were completely erased, and later they were entirely set up to fail. Winter Soldier 13 is the only one to survive, and she then vows to get revenge on the people who betrayed her, so she becomes a bounty hunter. While she takes up Norman's offer originally, she doesn't go through with it because she ends up discovering a data drive that can restore memories of her previous life that can only be activated through something in the garden. She does that, gets her memories back, and uses the Winter Song, which is like a souped up EMP, to disable technology in the region, which messes up Osborn's bounty. Of course, that wouldn't be the end of it, but from this point going forward, Winter Soldier is an ally of Spider-Man. Oh, also a Crossbones 2099 shows up in this, but he's just like a cyborg mercenary. He's not particularly special. We're gonna kind of buck the theme now, though Exodus doesn't really have as tight of a theme as many of the others do. The next comic is Loki 2099, however, this one is a little bit strange in relation to the others. This issue is less of a character showcase for Loki and more of the origin of a new location in this 2099 universe, New Asgard. It's not really relevant to anything else, and the characters who appear in this have never appeared again, but technically the issue follows a mysterious wanderer going by Loki, presumably the real Loki, but you can never tell with him, and a woman known as Valkyrie. The whole thing spins out of the Alchemax Aesir project. Remember that from the 90s one? They made a bunch of false Norse gods to exploit the Thorite religion. Apparently that happens in this 2099 as well, and then those gods get into an actual war with the real Asgardians. That goes pretty badly for the gods, but Loki is able to survive it and then sacrifices himself to make a new Asgard with this woman who is actually just a Thorite and not technically Asgardian herself. It'd be interesting if it mattered, but it doesn't, and the next one's very big, so let's just go ahead and move past Exodus issue 2, cause we gotta talk about the new 2099 Avengers. This issue throws so many characters at the wall that the majority of them don't really get much, if any, development, at least not until later, but all of them look cool, and so I'm definitely going to talk about them, especially because this has Moon Knight in it. The story doesn't begin with Moon Knight though, at least not just Moon Knight, and technically it doesn't even begin in 2099, but before that. Not much before though, it begins in 2098. This one does break the timeline a little bit because it tries to establish that Spider-Man 2099 was not actually the first hero of the 2099 era. There was an entire Avengers team in the previous year, they just didn't last super long and so were not successful enough to kickstart a new age of heroes. Why don't they last long? Well, it's because they get almost immediately murdered by the 2099 Masters of Evil: Radioactive Man, Black Knight, Iron Patriot, Enchantress, Melter, and Baron Zemo. So then you might be wondering, if a bunch of supervillains kill the Avengers, why is Earth not ruled by a bunch of supervillains? Well, it's because they got bored, and so they just leave and go into space to do villain stuff elsewhere. Like I've said a couple times, 2099 in this era is just writers doing whatever they want, but it's self-aware, so it's fun. The celestial crash is enough to bring the attention of the Masters back to Earth, in no small part because Norman Osborn was among their ranks. He was the guy in the Iron Patriot suit, though he didn't end up leaving for space with them. So they start heading back to their home planet, but they are seen by Moon Knight. Even in 2099, Moon Knight will never stay dead, and this version has been chilling in a cool cyber pyramid on the moon, just keeping watch in case he is ever needed again. When that time finally arrives, he assembles a new team of Avengers. Now, these characters get no real storyline at all, they just kind of show up to form the team, but they do contain some familiar faces, the rebooted versions of John Eisenhart Hulk and Roberta Mendez Captain America. Filling out the roster is Rowena Stern, Captain Marvel, Jaylee Arrow, Mackenzie Salgado, Wave, and Tashamba Black Panther. Notably not Kashamba from the Marvel Knights 2099, this one has a T in his name and is a different guy. While many of these characters will show up in future issues, and their ranks actually get extended, as we see in this final team shot that has other characters on the sides, yeah, for this comic, the 2099 Avengers just exist to be cool character designs. Really, they only show up in a fight scene, but it's a damn cool fight scene, and so I'm gonna give it a pass. God, I love Moon Knight in every form. Halfway through this second batch, we reach Black Widow 2099, Yelena Belova, though how she survives this long is never actually explained. In fact, they make a joke about not explaining it. I don't really need to spend time explaining her because it is one of the same Black Widows, she just has cool 2099 cyberpunk tech. Plus, there are other characters in this issue that deserve a spotlight, most notably 2099 Hawkeye, who is a villain. He is still a sniper-type archetype in the very loosest sense of the word though, as this Hawkeye does not use a bow, and instead uses a weird space station thing to kill his targets with basically an orbital laser? He doesn't have any individual powers, and he's not important, he dies in this same issue, but still, the idea of Hawkeye getting his codename because he kills people with direct targeting from a space station is hilarious and so worth mentioning. This issue also gives us a mutant kid named Nostromo, who is the successor to Latveria after Doom vanishes. Oh yeah, Doom vanished a little bit before this, it's largely just an excuse to not have him actively present in these ongoing events, but the introduction of Nostromo leads right into the next issue, which gives us the new X-Men 2099. This team has an even bigger lineup than the 2099 Avengers did, and their issue is the same length, so they get even less development. However, the team is a wild mix of characters from different concepts and eras. A few of them are just the same X-Men from the main timeline. Rogue, like many other people, has just managed to live this long, and Cable, as a time traveler, has appeared here just doing his thing. There are also more direct analogs of original X-Men characters. 2099 Cyclops has a transmutation-based power, kind of like Medusa, where he can turn people into stuff by looking at them, but he can't control it, and therefore uses this visor to keep his powers from killing everybody. There's also a new Phoenix, who is presumably just the newest host of the same Phoenix Force, though I don't know if this is ever explicitly stated, and Deadpool 2099, Warda Wilson, who is a strange case. There was technically a Deadpool 2099 comic about her that was published previously, but like several of the other 2099 spin-offs, it was just its own thing and not in the same universe as any of the others. Since this new 2099 just kind of mashes all those together and takes what the writers liked though, this version has the Deadpool 2099 from that spin-off. In the spirit of that combined 2099, there are also a few members of the original 90s X-Men 2099 in here as well, specifically Cerebra, Bloodhawk, and Skullfire. I didn't really mention those last two in detail in the previous section, but Skullfire can absorb and release energy, and Bloodhawk is just a weird monster man. Again, the roster is gigantic, so we're not going to cover them all, but I do also want to mention this guy, Tulkas. He is a super strength character with adrenaline powers, and he has a counterpart in the main timeline, but weirdly, the 2099 one appeared first. However, it was only by a couple of months. 2099 Tulkas appeared in August of 2022, and the main timeline one was in October of the same year. I'm really curious how exactly that came to be, but I don't know. This issue ends with the X-Men and Spider-Man showing up at the Celestial Guardian, and technically there is a finale issue for the final confrontation, which has the X-Men, Spider-Man, and Avengers all fighting Norman Osborn's forces. This one doesn't technically introduce a new character, but we do see Norman Osborn finally suit up, not as the Green Goblin, but as the Galactic Goblin. With the defeat of Norman Osborn, the next of the 2099 reboot series comes to a close, and we move on to the third one, Spider-Man 2099 Dark Genesis. This one is where they start having a lot more cohesive themes within them, and the theming of Dark Genesis is anti-heroes. The overarching villain of Dark Genesis is a new iteration of Carnage, once again spawned by the Venom symbiote, though this is not the same Carnage as the Prime timeline, and this one looks, in my opinion, way cooler, because for some reason, he's a dinosaur. I don't know why they did this, but as I will hit again and again in this era, these comics are kind of just about letting the creators have a fun time. Someone came up with the idea of Dinosaur Carnage, and so Dinosaur Carnage is what we got. Issue 1 also gives us a new hero, Spider-Woman 2099, who is an alien called an Iranion. We will get more development on the Iranions, but not till a later series, so I'll just save explanation of them for that part. As the name should make extremely obvious, Dark Genesis is a lot darker of a series than the previous one was, returning to the themes of corporate control over 2099 that the last one didn't get into as much. Even this Carnage is kind of an anti-hero himself, as his whole thing is murdering corrupt CEOs. While I don't typically have that much of an issue with this, Carnage's rampage becomes a little over the top in terms of bloodlust, spurred on even further by a new recanonized version of Halloween Jack. Issue 2 assembles an entire team of anti-heroes to take down Carnage, some new, some old. Spider-Man 2099 and Spider-Woman are still here, joined by Moon Knight and Venom 29 making their comebacks. We also get introduced to Blade 2099, who disappointingly does not get too much development, but we know that he is the son of the original Blade and is also somehow a zombie. So he's part zombie, part vampire, part human, and is also a surgeon in addition to being a monster hunter. So he's just a lot of things in one. Keeping up the insanely rapid-fire pace that Dark Genesis introduced characters at, the team also fights a new version of obscure Spider-Man villain Flipside, this one being a twisted robotic duplicate of Spider-Man 2099, because come on, what's a Spider-Man without evil clones? Also, Ghost Rider 2099 makes another appearance, which shouldn't be that much of a shock thematically. More surprising, Punisher shows up, but it's not the new Punisher 2099, it's Jake Gallows, who has been rebuilt as a second rebooted Punisher 2099, now a soulless, emotionless RoboCop ripoff, really. And then as a very last-minute addition in the final issue, we see Daredevil 2099, who had technically appeared in the first issue of Dark Genesis, but just as a regular lawyer, and we didn't know that he was going to become Daredevil. His name is Eric Nelson, and he's never really explained. He's only in this book for a couple of pages, and then the anti-hero team kills Carnage, and it's over. If Spider-Man 2099 Dark Genesis just sounded like a wild mess from me explaining it, yeah, that one's not my fault. Trust me, I read it all, and that is an authentic experience. I'm not really complaining about it because it's kind of just an anti-hero slugfest that was really fun to read, but boy, is the pacing intense. The next series of the 2099 reboot takes a kind of strange turn. It is another one that is focused around Spider-Man 2099. In fact, it is simply titled Miguel O'Hara Spider-Man 2099. But rather than the theme of new character introductions being Spider-Man like you'd expect, for some reason, the theme of this one is horror characters? The book starts off swinging by first introducing Miguel O'Hara's mom, who had not yet been seen in the reboot, and then immediately revealing that she has been infected with a zombie bite. Miguel webs her up and then takes her to Blade, who unsurprisingly makes another reappearance in this horror series. Blade and Miguel trace the source of the infection to a low-income community where they run into Bodio Man. Yay, he finally comes back! But he's a zombie now, along with all of his followers. They fight the zombies and trace everything to a scientist named Dr. Southey, who has done the classic zombie thing of trying to cure death and then discovering this weird undeath thing which he is now infecting people with. They send the zombies into space, and that's the end of that. This Spider-Man series is less interconnected by an actual overarching plot and more just by the general theme of monster villains. And who better to fit the monster villain theme than Dracula? That's right, we got 2099 vampires! Not only Dracula, but issue 2 also brings back Moon Knight 2099, who very happily for me is a recurring character in these comics, as you can probably tell. Plus, this one also very actively confirms that this Moon Knight is technically not even a human anymore, and is instead Khonshu just directly possessing and puppeting around the corpse of the most recent Moon Knight. The reason Moon Knight is here is that Dracula has returned and attacked his moon base, so Khonshu has called Spider-Man 2099, one of his closest allies, for help. Why is Dracula on the moon, you might ask? Well, get ready for some very campy crap. At some point before 2099, Dracula had established a vampire community known as Terra Rubra, but then Terra Rubra gets nuked by a human solar weapon which eliminates almost all the vampires and wounds Dracula greatly. So to save their leader, the vampires that are left load some soil along with Dracula's wounded body into a special coffin and then shoot the coffin to the moon so that he can recover. And then, once he's better, he wakes up and attacks Khonshu's moon base. This comic has a twist, however, because it turns out that while Dracula was healing, his vampire community had not gone fully extinct, and his daughter had instead led them to escape Earth into the stars. So now there's a whole society of space vampires, which doesn't get addressed much in this issue, but just you wait, that is going to be an incredibly major plot point in just a couple of minutes, so we will be coming back to it. So we have zombies, we have vampires, now let's move on to werewolves. Issue 3 of this series gives us Werewolf by Night 2099, whose concept is pretty simple, but a decent port of the werewolf trope to a cyberpunk setting. This werewolf's name is Creighton Rusoff, and somewhat surprisingly, he is not some sort of genetic experiment or cyborg. He is an actual werewolf, like magically infected with lycanthropy. After his transformation, he was struck with silver weaponry, which poisoned him, and now he works for a corporation called Cobalt, who cannot cure his condition, but can provide him with medication that keeps him alive. Of course, to continue receiving the silver antidote, Creighton has to work for Cobalt as one of their superpowered enforcers, and then the comic takes a somewhat predictable turn. Cobalt turns out to be the ones who were poisoning him in the first place, and then manipulating him into being one of their assets. Spider-Man 2099 helps him realize this fact, and then his fate is actually left open, as the issue ends by saying one of two things will happen. Either one, he continues working for Cobalt so that he can live, or two, he turns against his masters, gains his freedom, but then will eventually succumb to the silver poisoning and perish. And this Werewolf by Night never appears again, so presumably he fights back against Cobalt and also dies in the process. Issue 4 diverges a bit from the classic monster theme, but stays in horror territory as it decides to give us a 2099 iteration of a classic Marvel character, Terror. Not one that many of you have heard of, but I guarantee you that those of you who know Terror are probably very excited that he makes an appearance. He's kind of a cult classic. I guess he is sort of classic monster, as his power is demonic in nature. The story of the original Terror was of a man who killed a demonic bear and then was cursed to assume that bear's form, turning into this weird green monster man. 2099 Terror is still that Terror. Like so many other characters, he's an immortal and has just persisted to this time. Thus, the Terror Showcase issue of 2099 is kind of just a normal terror story that takes place in the future. This monster has the ability to graft the limbs of other people onto his own body in any way, allowing him to use their powers and abilities. In the future of 2099, Terror is running a kind of Ripperdoc operation called the Body Shop, which he uses to source new limbs for himself. This runs him afoul of Spider-Man 2099, the two fight, and that's the issue. This is not a complicated one. This brings us to the final comic in the horror set, another one that I teased briefly when we started this section, Man-Thing 2099. The Man-Thing issue begins by introducing the readers to another very important corporation within this universe, Pixel Corp. While Alchemax is technically on the top of the heap, Pixel Corp's specialty is data collection, think like Facebook but on steroids. They surveil literally everything, collecting as much data as they can and then selling it to the highest bidder. Therefore, when a scientist named Cadmon Gray develops a method that can make humans invisible to machine surveillance, he instantly becomes a target. Pixel sends some men to assassinate him, and they are successful. However, very importantly, this issue ties back to one of the previous batches because Cadmon was operating out of the Celestial Garden that crashed into the planet a while ago. This place is now occupied mostly by mutants and is referred to as Oasis X. When the Pixel henchmen assassinate Cadmon, they dump him into a river here, but importantly, this river is still full of weird celestial tech. Therefore, Dr. Gray is turned into this biotechnological monstrosity known as the Man-Thing, not just running on Oasis X machinery, but also his own data tech. Rather than causing fear with a touch like the original, the touch of this Man-Thing instantaneously erases all data, which wouldn't necessarily be great in a lot of settings, but in a cyberpunk world, it is incredibly overpowered. Communication devices, weaponry, even cybernetic implants instantaneously stop functioning the second Man-Thing gets his hands on them, which means he's able to counter everything Pixel sends pretty easily. Given that Spider-Man 2099's powers are biological in nature, Miguel has quite an edge, and is able to take the Man-Thing down out of a monstrous rampage. However, he does not beat him up entirely or bring him in. Miguel still lets Man-Thing erase the Pixel Corp data reserves and then escape into the sewers, because, he's a mindless monster, so he was a danger, but ultimately what he was trying to do was not that bad. Man-Thing is the final of this horror batch, a very strange series in the 2099 reboot, and also the last one that we're going to see which takes place on Earth. The next, Annihilation 2099, is going to start moving into space things. We established the existence of the 2099 Nova Corps way back in the Conan one-shot, but this comic gives us more information on them finally. Issue 1 of Annihilation 2099 shows us that the Corps has been decimated, and their last surviving member is Wolverine. I'm sure at least a few of you were wondering where exactly he was, because we've seen so many characters who just live long enough that they survived to 2099, and unsurprisingly, Wolverine is one of these. However, some run-ins that are never fully explained have damaged his healing factor and left him without some limbs that now simply aren't regrowing. To try and find a way to fix this, he has journeyed into space. He meets up with the Nova Corps and volunteers for an experimental procedure designed to infuse the Nova Force, the energy which gives the Novas their powers, into living cells. Given his healing factor, he's a great candidate for this, but as the process is happening, it attracts an alien species called exoparasites who kill everyone around, except of course for Wolverine himself. Even though his healing factor is now even stronger than it was thanks to the infusion of Nova Force in his system, the exoparasite invasion is too much, and Xandar is destroyed, with every resident being infected and transformed into another member of the alien monsters. This, though, is not technically the plot of the issue. We see this in a flashback that Wolverine is telling to a bartender, because this is a very classic Wolverine story, and also, it's a Western. After the destruction of the Nova Corps, Wolverine is basically just a lone wanderer traveling throughout the galaxy and helping people that he can. And while he's at this bar, it is attacked by a bunch of cowboy symbiotes? I've said it several times before, I'm saying it again now, and I will be saying it again. The Reboot 2099 is just an excuse for writers to have fun. Wolverine beats them, of course, and that's the end of the main storyline, but this comic ends with a little teaser for the overarching plotline. While the previous Spider-Man batch was just a bunch of individual horror one-shots, Annihilation returns to there being one connecting thread between them, and at the end of the Wolverine Nova one-shot, we see a gang of space pirates recover the floating coffin of Dracula. It is space vampire time! This won't come to a head just yet. It's one of those things where the ending of every issue advances the plot a little bit till a final conclusion, so you're gonna have to be patient. Meanwhile, issue 2 of Annihilation is about Star-Lord. Star-Lord 2099 is a lone intergalactic hero named Amandla Estrellas. Her home planet was destroyed, but she was rescued by a Wakandan relief team. At this point in the timeline, unsurprisingly, Wakanda has gone very intergalactic, and they also provided her with a vibranium suit. Her suit, by the way, is incredible, one of my favorite costumes of the entire Reboot era, though I'll be honest, I might just like it because it reminds me of Power Rangers, but that does not invalidate its awesomeness. It's very openly stated within this comic that the adventure we see today is just one of many that Star-Lord has as she journeys from planet to planet, but in this particular one, she fights a living star. This star is technically Quasar 2099, though it has basically nothing to do with the original Quasar from the main timeline. If anything, it's closer to Ego 2099, living planet, living star. That's what I would have gone with, but whatever. The Ego thing actually would work on 2 levels because this star is oppressing all the planets within its system, demanding that they worship it as a god and pay it tribute, destroying them if they do not. How does Star-Lord defeat some sort of living sun god? Well, she discovers that it's actually not a god at all. It appears that it was once a normal star, but was animated as part of a rogue science experiment. It is powered by machinery at its core, which she is able to overload, reverting it to just a normal sun once again. And then, of course, the final page of the issue progresses the Dracula storyline a little bit more, with the next issue continuing the themes of this one. Though not the Dracula themes, I mean the Power Rangers themes. Issue 3 stars a crew of space miners who look like this, and I really shouldn't have to explain that visual inspiration to you. The miners land on a strange planet which seems to be alive, so I guess that's why Ego wasn't in the previous one. Ego is in this issue. One of the miners gets separated from the rest of his team and is forced to eat some of the material he finds inside Ego to survive. Now, before I show you what happens, I want you guys to guess. What character do you think this is a 2099 version of? It is a main timeline one, and it is guessable, but I want to see if any of you guys can get it. If you want to put your answer in the comments, go right ahead. I'll give you a second to do so before I spoil it. All right, you ready? Well, this guy, named Ross Romero, was essentially his team's Red Ranger, so when he gets mutated, it's only natural that he turns into Red Hulk. By consuming some of Ego's flesh, Red Hulk has essentially inherited its power, which becomes immediately relevant as the planet is then slaughtered by Terrax, who in this reality is known as Terrax the Planet Hunter. And then the rest of the issue is just a big punch fest between Red Hulk and Terrax. It's not complicated, it's very much meant to be a Power Rangers thing, and I love it. Though I can't help but wonder if the original concept for this character came from a writer just seeing the older comic Planet Hulk and deciding to take it more literally. And then, of course, one more little Dracula teaser, he is getting closer. At this point, I hope all of you are as hyped about Annihilation 2099 as I am, because literally every issue in this miniseries is so cheesy and so cool. That is going to continue with the next one, which is my favorite, the demonic-empowered Silver Surfer 2099. Unlike what you might expect, this is actually not the Norrin Radd Silver Surfer. Yes, he lives long enough to theoretically still be around in this era, but this is a different character altogether, one directly connected to Mephisto, which is very fitting as Mephisto actually made his first appearance in a classic Silver Surfer book. This surfer's name is Jonah Marlowe. Once a human from Earth who was dying of cancer, he was visited by Mephisto in his final moments and offered a deal. If he would sell his soul, he would receive great power in exchange for becoming Mephisto's emissary. Now, as Satan's surfer, he is not a herald of Galactus, but instead a strange celestial entity who appears to mortals in their times of need and convinces them to make deals to his master like he did. Very cool twist on the original Silver Surfer concept. I absolutely love what they did with this version of the character. Also, we just need to take a moment to appreciate how perfect his design is. They took the idea of demonic Silver Surfer and did it flawlessly. The empty flaming core, the connected horns on his head, God, he looks awesome! As I'm sure everyone was able to predict, the point of this issue is Silver Surfer inevitably rebelling against his master's orders. In this specific case, he was sent to make a deal with a dying mother, an easy mark as he knew she would take any deal necessary to spend more time with her children. But she was a good woman who didn't deserve this trickery, and so it's the final straw for the Surfer, who refuses to do it and is summoned to Mephisto's realm to be punished. But Mephisto can kind of sense that punishment is what the Surfer wants. He wishes to die and therefore face penance for the sins of his life. Therefore, in classic devil fashion, Mephisto twists things on him, cursing the Surfer with immortality for the second time in 2099, funny enough, and leaving him to his own ends. So the Surfer now flies throughout the galaxy doing as much good as he can to absolve himself of his past crimes, which weirdly is a kind of good deal. I'm surprised that Mephisto let this happen because, like, yeah, now the Surfer is a really powerful superhero who is doing a lot of good in the world. And as has happened for the previous 3 issues, it ends with a little bit of a Dracula teaser. But the next issue is the final one of Annihilation 2099, which means this teaser is immediately going somewhere. Time for issue 5, Undead or Alive. In the previous teasers at the ends of the comics, Dracula had vampirized the space pirates that had found him, turning them into his henchmen, but then their ship had crashed into a planet called Midas. All of them were injured in this crash, but survived, and this final issue is them recovering and breaking out. For something that had been teased for so long, the plot of this issue is shockingly less complex than you might think. It really is just Dracula and the other vampires breaking out and taking over the planet. The most notable thing that happens is that Dracula encounters Darkhawk 2099, but Darkhawk fans, this is not the one that you're familiar with. It's just like a literal dark hawk, like a giant demon bird monster that was imprisoned beneath the planet's surface, and of course Dracula takes this into his army as well. Now, the only other really important thing to note about this overarching Dracula plotline is the reason why Dracula was in space in the first place. He was trying to reach the vampire homeworld, the one that had been established when the vampires left Earth as he was recovering. The Midas thing was just a detour. The comic ends with him returning to this mission, which might seem kind of odd. I mean, again, this is something that had been teased for issue after issue, but in this comic, Dracula just takes over Midas, gets more power in the form of the Darkhawk and Midas's resources, and then that's it, he moves on. But this is not the end of the Dracula plotline. In fact, far from it. Up until this point, all of the batches of 2099 Reboot comics had been their own self-contained thing, sometimes with character crossovers and sometimes with overarching plotlines connecting them, but still pretty isolated. Annihilation changes this, because the entire comic was set up for the next batch, Conquest 2099, an entire Dracula 2099-centric series. This one unifies everything that we've seen so far. Dracula now has an entire army of sci-fi space vampires, and it's going to take a huge team up to bring him down. We get space characters from Annihilation 2099 and also Earth-based ones. This one finally brings back Spider-Man 2099, who wasn't in Annihilation at all. And boy, is Dracula mad when Conquest 2099 starts, because after amassing his new army, he finally reaches the vampire homeworld and realizes that he is too late. It has already been destroyed, his people are dead, and now he's on the hunt for revenge. Cue an interplanetary war with the Iranians. Remember, I very briefly mentioned them earlier because that's the alien species that Spider-Woman is a part of? This is where they finally become plot relevant. They are an incredibly strong, warlike species led by a barbarian named Spider-Side, technically a name variant of a main timeline character, though he doesn't really have anything to do with the main Spider-Side. They also, of course, have their own spider hero type champions. We get a Web Weaver 2099, which is a very obscure pull, but not one I'm going to argue with because he looks really, really cool. Eventually, Earth is informed of the war between space spiders and space vampires and sends some of their own heroes to investigate. Meanwhile, the intergalactic heroes are converging as well. We get an awesome fight between Space Dracula and Demon Silver Surfer. It's just so wild. As things progress, the fighting spreads not just to Earth's heroes, but to the planet itself, as Spider-Side finds out that Earth is Dracula's original homeworld and sends his army to conquer it too. Over the course of the series, more Iranian spider variants are introduced, including both Ghost Spider and Madam Web, and the conflict eventually comes to a close when the leaders of both armies are defeated. Spider-Side is killed by Dracula, and then Dracula is shot into space by Silver Surfer, far enough that his corpse will not be relevant to the galaxy anymore. Annihilation Conquest ends with both of the warring parties actually surviving in one way or another. Much of the Iranians are decimated, but their survivors are led by Madam Web, and the space vampires are led by Lilith, Dracula's daughter, who is returned to life, or unlife, or whatever. Now that Conquest 2099 has concluded, we are at the end of the 2099 reboot, at least what we've currently gotten, though there will be more. The final panel teases Galactus 2099 reviving Dracula. This is apparently going to be seen in 2025, though the comic has not been officially announced yet. I love the 2099 reboot. I'll be honest, I hadn't read all of it until I decided to do this video, but I'm so glad that I did. It is wild from start to finish, and as I will say one final time, it's clearly just written for fun, and that's what these kind of comics are meant for. And now, in the spirit of this being an accurate video, I do have to address one final thing before we wrap up, and this is kind of going to break the cohesive timeline of everything, but blame Marvel for it, not me. There is another 2099 series that released after the reboot, this being Symbiote Spider-Man 2099, which stars Miguel, but in a symbiote arc, as the name should make fairly obvious. Here's the thing, it's not part of the reboot, it's considered part of the original canon. I do kind of get why they did this, because they brought back Peter David, the writer of the original Spider-Man 2099, to tell another story in his world, and that's cool, but I do wish that they had branded it separately because it is not related to the reboot. Why couldn't they have called it 2099 Classic or something? Though transitioning nicely into the ending segment for this video, I guess that Marvel introducing just a little bit more timeline weirdness right at the end is the most accurate thing that they could have done to 2099's history. 2099, it's kind of a mess. I hope that I presented it to you effectively in this video, but my god, it took me so long to parse out all the different timeline things, and honestly, I couldn't have done it without help. You've never seen me do this in a YouTube video before, which should tell you just how much help I did actually need, but I gotta specifically shout out a real-life buddy of mine, Luna, who is a huge 2099 nerd. I could not have done this video without their assistance. They are also an artist and animator on both Instagram and Blue Sky under the username ThatRandomRobot. Please go check out their work and give them a follow. I need to give them something back for putting up with all the questions I bombarded them with while making this video. Now, as complicated as all of this has been, let's try to end this very long project with some sort of lesson and moral about narrative. I like ending the feature-length videos with that. Though despite all the complexity of these lines of comics, and actually I guess because of it, there is definitely a lesson that we can learn from 2099. While the confusion around its timeline might be very annoying at times, the 2099 comics are still pretty cool, right? And we do need to remember that is the point. As much as I am kind of a historian for the Marvel world, these comics are not history. Not everything is going to line up perfectly, and they're just meant to be fun. Look, the pop culture space on the internet is very negative at times. I think we all know that, and I could so easily take the end of this video in that direction and just complain about how long it took for me to put all this together. But instead, I'm gonna go hard in the opposite direction. 2099 is enjoyable, and when you're reading these books, which by the way, I do highly recommend, I'm always going to end these long videos by telling you to go pick up the comics yourself, I hope that you focus on the superheroes doing cool superhero stuff and having their own stories rather than how exactly the canon works. Now, I'm not saying that continuity isn't important or that it's something that can be ignored, but I am absolutely saying that the fun part comes first. And in terms of the canon, well, that's what I'm here for. You can leave the complicated stuff to me. So I guess that means the moral of this video, in a sense, is that when you pick up a comic book, which again, I sincerely hope all of you do, don't overthink it, don't worry about if it's stupid or nonsensical. The most important thing is to have some shocking fun with it. Thank you all so much for watching. These feature-length videos take forever to make, but I really do think that 2099 deserved one. I hope you all agree with me and enjoyed this whole thing. Since I am tired and have so much editing to do, I will do the ending plugs fast. First off, I have a Patreon. You can get early ad-free access to all my long-form videos and an exclusive video every month. The link to that is in the description of this video, on my YouTube channel page, and also my username there is the exact same as it is here, so it's not difficult to find. Extra big thank you to those supporting me there already. Making content for you is my full-time job, so supporting me there really helps me continue to do that. Speaking of helping me, shout out to my artist, Ruben Perez, who drew the avatar you've been watching talk at you for the last 2 hours. Go check him out on his socials, he does a fantastic job. And finally, now the audio recording for this video is done. I need a nap, and I think it's gonna be a long one, so I will see you all in 2099.